Okay, so welcome back, everyone. And if you're here for the first time, welcome. I'm Rocky. I'm a yoga nerd, self-proclaimed, and you're amongst good company for sure. So, as has been customary for these sessions, I always like to kind of take a moment to recap and refresh and at least, as I said yesterday, like take a few steps back before we forge ahead. So now that you've had a chance to digest and assimilate and integrate at least some of the information we've been covering this weekend, I'm happy to take one or two questions, not so much about the Vinyasa class, we're going to dive into that a lot, but as it relates to anything that we've covered previously, the regress progress, the isometrics, the somatic theming class, anything kind of percolating for you that is in need of further clarification. If you'd like, you can go ahead and pop it in the Q&A box down there, and I'm happy to take one, maybe two questions briefly if that would be of value. Just for what it's worth, the Facebook group that you guys have all been invited to and many of you are in, I will continue to monitor that Facebook group after this weekend. This course will continue to be, I believe, continue to be available as a recording. So there'll be more people joining that Facebook group, and I'm sure more relevant and valuable questions that will continue to unfold. So my plan is to check in on that Facebook group every Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific. So this is not your last chance to chat with me. Let's see, big question for today, if possible, to address at some point, maybe later, it's more anatomy. Can you speak to the notion of don't put your knee past your toes in Skandasana and proper lifting form in squats? We put our knees past our toes a lot, and a lot of us have been told we're supposed to cue not to do that in Warrior Two and lunges. That's a good question. So the short answer to that is I am sort of the belief that cue is a little bit fear-mongery. I understand the sentiment. So when we talk about yoga poses and we talk about shapes, it can be kind of a slippery slope into like a free-for-all when we say that there's maybe not a right or a wrong way to do any pose, right? So if we say like in Warrior Two, your knee can go towards your big toe, it can go towards your pinky toe, it can go past your toes, it can stay behind your ankle, your leg can be straight, your leg can be bent, you can do it on the floor, you can do it with your back knee bent or straight, your arms can be up. At a certain point, it's like, well, at what point do we kind of agree upon the baseline of what Virabhadrasana 2 is? And in terms of a shape, a profile of joint positions and movements, Vira 2 is decidedly not something else, it's Virabhadrasana 2. Right, so I don't have a problem with kind of creating a baseline of understanding of what Virabhadrasana 2 is and what Virabhadrasana 2 isn't. And of course, that's going to depend on the lineage you come from, your teachers, like your exposure to these movements. But it's a different thing to say that this is what Virabhadrasana 2 is, and versus saying that to do Virabhadrasana 2 outside of this particular pattern, this particular organization is unsafe or is dangerous. And I think what happens a lot of times as we try to kind of encourage our students, or we're encouraged as students to create discernment and specificity and alignment around a particular pose, sometimes that buy-in is established by convincing you that if you don't do it this way, something bad's going to happen. Like if your knee goes past your ankle, then something bad will happen. Or if your knee points in a direction other than your toes, then your knee will explode or something bad will happen. And that can be a very motivating factor to pay attention and to do it just so. I somewhat reject that notion because it can also create some unproductive habits of belief around how your body operates and how your body moves. To your point, there are many positions like Skandasana, like Malasana, like Utkatasana, like Vajrasana, there are many poses and many movements that you do throughout your life. Pay attention in the course of your day, how many times your knee goes past your ankle, and like every time you take a step, potentially that happens. So obviously your knee moving past your ankle is not a position that's going to cause damage to your knee. It would take a little bit more time to dive into kind of the biomechanics of force to address sort of how, like, for instance, why in Virabhadrasana 2, there might be more force going into your knee than in a shape like Skandasana or in a shape like Anjaneyasana, like putting the back knee on the floor, or a shape like Malasana. And the question isn't so much, at what position, like biomechanics doesn't give us a lot of information about what is safe and what is unsafe. It just gives us information about how force is distributed. So to have a conversation around what's safe and what's unsafe for you, we have to examine your capacity to organize force and to contend with force, and to manage the forces that are moving through your body. So for some folk, putting their knee past their ankle could be overloading their knee relative to the strength that they have to kind of sustain that position. For others, that might not be the case. We also want to look at things like the variable of time. Going into Virabhadrasana 2 and holding that pose for, say, 5 to 10 breaths with your knee past your ankle, the longer you're holding that position, the more time under tension, you're going to start to diminish your capacity to sustain the pose, right? So holding the pose as a shape for a long period of time, then by the time you come out of that pose, you might be fatigued and you don't quite organize yourself out of the shape as skillfully as you could. That's very different than, for example, if I was to put a blanket down and go here and slide back into something like Virabhadrasana 2, in order to slide the blanket forward, I might shift my weight forward to then slide back in, right? So as a sort of movement, right? In a movement arc, my knee going past my ankle would probably be a good idea to help kind of offset and offload those particular forces. So there's more questions that always, I think, need to be asked, contextual questions, before we determine if something is appropriate or inappropriate. And when you make a kind of hard and fast rule, like don't ever do this or else, that sort of ends the conversation. And to your point, you're asking the question because you don't want that conversation to end. So in short, I would say your knee going past your ankle is not dangerous. That said, when I teach Virabhadrasana 2 to a new student and I want them to understand what Virabhadrasana 2 is, I want to help them understand when their knee is over their ankle, right? So they have adequate kind of kinesthetic awareness to locate where that is. It's one thing to say, place your knee over your ankle, and then you look around and someone's knee is past their ankle. If they think their knee is over their ankle, but it's not, I'll give the instruction, or I'll give the feedback that, no, your knee is not over your ankle, not because I'm trying to keep them safe from that dangerous position, but I want to increase their safety by helping them understand more clearly where their body is in space. That makes sense? So there's the things I think often contribute to a lack of stability have more to do with our proprioception, our ability to know where we are in space, or where we are relative to ourselves, about particular positions. And, that can make things more complicated, because if you've been taught alignment under the premise that the alignment keeps you in a margin of safety, and then you're kind of exposed to this concept that, hey, maybe it is safe to move out of alignment, then how do you make the decision of what is Warrior 2? In my view, you can still make that decision. You can still teach knee over ankle, knee pointing in line with your toes. You can still teach that and hold your students accountable to that, without kind of the caveat of or else, right? So I'm a big advocate of kind of removing the or else, because that can contribute to patterns of belief that pain science, which is a whole wild, wonderful world of study, could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If someone comes to my class and they've heard many, many times not to put their knee in a particular place, and I ask them to put their knee in that place, that might send them into kind of a dissonance where they're trying to reconcile a previous belief with what I'm asking them to do, and that all could render them less stable and actually more susceptible to injury or to pain. So it's always a bit more complicated. and more nuanced, I think, than you know, the rules might suggest. Okay, that said, in a 200-hour teacher training, it might make good sense to kind of create clear parameters and boundaries around the poses, because there's so much that we're trying to organize and teach and convey in a yoga class that might be an area of study that we best kind of boundary and limit while we kind of work on the other aspects of teaching. Okay, so keep asking those types of questions and explore and experiment. And when in doubt, if you want to kind of progress a joint position like that, consider regressing some other aspect of the pose, maybe putting your back knee on the floor, right? So that you can send a bit more range into the front knee without overloading the knee. And then you can kind of play and see what the parameters are for that feeling sustainable in your own body. Okay. Good question. Okay, I am going to forge ahead here. At the end of the session today, I'm going to stay on to do a little bit longer of a Q&A. So if you have questions, please either hold on to them or put them in the Q&A box. Please don't put them in the chat box because I won't be able to scroll through and find them, but place your questions down there. If the question is answered at some point during the session today, also feel free to leave the question so I don't have a redundancy there, because I might forget what I talk about. Okay, so there's 122 of you on the call. Is this a call? On the Zoom. Glad we got Zoom up and running today. There was some technical quagmires this morning that we were unsure about, so happy that we made it. And I'm assuming, so show of hands, who practiced the single limb flow? Whether you did that this morning or had done it sometime previously. All right. Okay, I think about 80 of you. 80 of you practiced single limb flow. That means 80 of you didn't perish, you didn't die, you made it. It's a hard class, like I did it too. I did it and I talked through it. There's sort of like the adrenaline burst that happens when you're filming. Like sometimes my practice class looks very different than when I'm by myself, like huffing and puffing through it on my own. So well done on surviving the class. We're gonna take an in-depth look at essentially how it is that I came up with that class, how it is that I went about sequencing that class. And the intention is not to suggest that you all should be able to do that. Of course, like this is a mixed level training, and I'm super respectful and I honor where all of us are in our movement practice. The further we move into kind of the intermediate advanced syllabus of yoga poses and even of practice styles, of which vinyasa I would say is a more advanced style for me, a more advanced style of practice than some of what we've looked at previously. It is also possible, as sort of the level increases, the possible functionality also tends to decrease, right? So I can't think of like a time in my life where being able to do that single limb flow is going to make my life better, just in terms of movements, like going from down dog to Urdhva Dhanurasana. Probably won't pull on that skill in my life off the mat. So, as the syllabus of yoga increases and becomes more complicated and progressed, the opportunities for application start to, for me, become a little bit more thematic and a little bit more metaphoric. The more challenging something is, the more I'm invited to kind of access my own kind of sense of balance and steadiness and stability amidst kind of the shifting sands and tides of life on and off the mat. So I hope that makes sense. It's fun, for me to play with more complicated movements and test the limits of what's possible for myself. But it's certainly not a mark of the health and and longevity of my body that I can do all of that. So just a little disclaimer there. If you were not able to make it all the way through class, you're still a great yogi, you're still a good person, and you can still reap the benefits of this training and of your yoga practice, of course. I'm using that class really more as an example of what I would consider a creative vinyasa flow sequence that combines my own kind of creativity with also the kind of science-based, technique that we've explored throughout this weekend already in terms of being able to regress and progress movements. And that really is kind of where vinyasa lives for me. Compare that to class on Friday, where we're really working on a particular movement. Right? I'm not so much tapping on or accessing my creative mind in terms of like transitions and choreography. I'm sort of taking that off the table to work on a specific skill. Okay, so once those skills are in place, we can start to combine them in complex, dynamic, and hopefully stimulating ways. So I'm seeing some of your feedback already from the class in the chat box. Feedback is ranging from I almost died to the class was challenging. Hypermobility made it more so having to engage and support all the things. That was intense, that was intense, that was intense but awesome, super sweaty, almost died, loved it. Let's see, there's more. Challenging, very good, intelligently sequenced, yes. Second time through, it was much easier. Yes, repetition is a good thing. Surprise from Emily, surprised how much of the practice I was able to do. Anxious to try it after looking through the PDF, yeah, but felt empowered to choose to regress when I need to modify and keep going at the top of my current level. Woot, woot. Felt like a level 3. What did it say on the thing? Did it say level 2? Did it say intermediate? Who knows? I would call it a strong class, level 2, 3, level 3 class. Okay, so any additional feedback that you guys like to share here? I'm curious to see what some of, yes, what your experience was. So if your feedback is, to me, that felt like level 3, I will not disagree with that whatsoever. But what were some of your takeaways from the class? And I'm going to ask, this often happens in a teacher training setting where we start to practice together and kind of our teacher hat is placed to the side and our practice hat gets put on, and it becomes kind of more about our experience as a student in the class. So I completely honor that. It's hard to go through a class like this and not sort of be confronted with your own body and its possibilities and your own experience. It's quite sensory rich in that way. But I'll ask you to consider as a teacher what some of your, for those of you that teach, which I know most of you do, what some of your takeaways were just in terms of the topic at hand, which is sequencing. Right? So what did you learn from this class? What did you like about the class? Also, like what didn't work for you about this class? Was able to recognize the progression within the practice. Yeah, love the regressions and progressions in the vinyasa sequence. Was able to get into the poses a lot easier than I had expected because of the warm-ups and familiarity built in. Yes, a partner would have been so helpful at the end. Unfortunately, my boyfriend was still sleeping when I did, and not that he would have been any help anyway. Fair enough. Love the cool down sequence. Cueing and sequencing was fabulous. Love the different ways, move from one pose to another, things I've not done or seen. A couple more here. Wild thing pose was hectic. Word. As a teacher, I would allow more time in the intense poses. Breathing there brings awareness and proprioception of where the body is and how I can, how I can not intensify the pose, but find ease in that effort. Good feedback, yep. What I got from class is that I can take threads from the class and make it accessible. Good, I love the progression, and for higher mobility, could be risky for the shoulders. Great stretches, I will adopt. Last thing here, this got me to think more about the little tweaks I can add to a pose. Example, the opening, just lifting your arms one at a time in Balasana to make it more of a dynamic shoulder, upper back warm up. Beautiful. So please know that with everything that I teach in person, in a training, online, well, this probably goes without saying, but the goal is never kind of to like, I mean, you are all more than welcome to teach any of my sequences. The reason that I teach in the way that I do is because I want you to embody it. And if it makes sense and feels good and resonant with you, they are yours to teach. I do not own these movements. And for me, they are the synthesis of lots of different movements that I've seen out there and sequences that I've taken. So feel free to borrow as much, as little of my sequences as you'd like. It's why we've included the PDFs in this course. But my approach to offering training this weekend in this way is I really wanted to give you guys a sort of code or a key to understand a little bit more of how my mind works, so that all of the classes that I have online can be an opportunity for you to learn a little more about sequencing or get ideas that you can apply to your own sequences. Whenever I teach anything, I often have multiple intentions going on. For the students out there, I want to provide a nourishing, stimulating experience. And for the teachers, I also want to share my ideas with you guys so that you can pass it on and share it with others. So, personally, I never really learned how to sequence in a formal way. I mean, I've kind of gotten piecemeal instructions on different sequencing approaches over the years. But the way that I learned how to sequence was taking other teachers' classes, oftentimes online, writing down their sequences and trying my best to kind of slip into their brain and say, like, I wonder what they were thinking, putting this pose here. I wonder, why we sat down and did that thing before we stood up and did that thing. And even though my answers might be different than what the teacher themselves were actually thinking, that process of analysis was very edifying for me. And that's what I continue to do when I look at other teachers' sequences. So this course is really born from that and wanting to demystify what some of my process is, so you don't have to speculate, but you can actually hear firsthand from me what it is that I do. And along with that, I'll say, kind of like, be careful what you wish for, because for those of you that were perhaps expecting like here's exactly the sequence or here's exactly what I do, my process is I'm a nerd. Like, I like to ask lots of questions, and usually asking questions and getting answers leads to more questions. So I'm just in this process for the love of it, because it's stimulating for me. And your approach may look like mine, it very well may not, but nevertheless, if you are interested in I'll say, being able to sequence in the way that I do, it means asking the kinds of questions that I do and pursuing answers accordingly. Oh, there's a lot of kind words being said here. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. So without further ado, let's dive into this particular sequence. And I'll just say, this particular type of class, of course, the reason we're doing this last is that it is the most complex type of class to sequence. And likewise, it's sort of the most complex to kind of walk you through, because the process, much like the vinyasa process, the process that I use to create this is not linear, right? It's not that I kind of start regress, I'm kind of progress up to a certain peak. There is a natural progression, but as is the case with vinyasa classes, it's sort of sporadic, right? We do something and then we circle back around and do it again, and we circle back around and do it again, and maybe something gets added in, something gets taken away, something else gets added in, something progresses, we might pause and get something else in play and then thread that back in, and then it's, so it's complex, it's dynamic. These are the words of the day: complex dynamism. And much like life, right? Life kind of follows a linear progression of time, but so within that progression, there's a lot of repetition and recursion, right? You might wake up and do the same thing every day to a certain extent, but in that process of repetition, you are growing and you are progressing, and sometimes it might seem like you're regressing even as you endeavor to move forward. So I think, one of the things that I love so much about the vinyasa practice and I think why it appealed to me when I first started practicing yoga is, especially in sort of a mixed level environment, is that it does seem to provide the most kind of metaphoric example of how life works, right? There's people all around you that are in different parts of their journey than you. Some have more than you, some have less than you, some know or are able to do more or less, however you want to quantify that. Life continues to kind of roll and move forward, whether you want it to or not, and you have to kind of decide when you're going to go with the flow, when you might buck the current, when you might pause and sit down and take a rest, so on and so forth. So I like the kind of personal responsibility and authority that a mixed level vinyasa class requires, because you can't have every little detail managed for you. You yourself have to be somewhat self-reliant to the sustainability of what unfolds, and a lot of that occurs with some trial and error. Admittedly, as things get more complex, the risk also increases. You know, there's a lot of movements in this particular sequence that if you were new to yoga and you were trying to kind of jam your way into them, you probably hurt yourself, right? Admittedly, a lot of these, the shoulder flossing, these shoulder movements are complicated movements that take quite a bit of coordination, strength, and mobility to do well. You know, truthfully, I think I mentioned as it relates to the single leg stability class, that class was kind of born out of the Warrior 3 to Ardha Chandrasana transition, and my awareness, my experience teaching that transition in studios where I was told I wasn't allowed to because it wasn't safe. I've also taught at studios that have forbidden Wild Thing, and especially the transition of Wild Thing to Urdhva Dhanurasana, to wheel pose, as being not allowed, because it is unsafe. And one of the reasons that I think that transition is often taken off the table as being unsafe, much like the Warrior 3 to Ardha Chandra, is because it's not often taught, right? A lot of the things that are very complicated and potentially say dangerous that we do in our yoga practice are often not really broken down, regressed, explained, and taught in a vinyasa class. It's sort of like you might get that instruction, like if it's in your practice, if you know how, if it works for you, go ahead and flip into wheel pose. I remember when I first started practicing vinyasa, I was doing so at large studios, or studios with many students, like 100, 200 people in the room, donation based. And whenever it was time to work on inversions, or whenever it was time to do an arm balance, or kind of complicated transitions like this, that was the instruction. Like, now it's time to do inversions. If it's in your practice, do a headstand. If you know how, do shoulder stand. If you're in wide-legged forward bend, Prasarita Padottanasana, and you would like to go up into a headstand, go for it. And I would look around and be like, well, how do these people know how to do that? Like, where do I go to learn that? Do I have to sign up for a workshop? Do I have to stick around and talk to the teacher afterwards? Do I just have to magically possess this skill? So, you know, while this class is a pretty advanced class, and there's plenty that's taken for granted in terms of your familiarity with what I would call, you know, fundamental vinyasa skills. Things like Ujjayi Pranayama is not really taught in this class. It's used but not taught. The movements of sun salutations I'm not really breaking down at a fundamental level. I'm assuming that if you're choosing to press play on a intermediate advanced vinyasa class, that you're familiar with the movements of sun salutations and standing poses, and pranayama, bandha, etc., so that I then can progress the instruction and actually teach something like a flip dog into Urdhva Dhanurasana. Not just use it or do it or invite you to do it, but actually let that be now kind of what the peak of this class is. So, you know, I would encourage, you know, of course, if you teach at a studio that says no to some of these things, it's a delicate balance to kind of figure out how to approach it. If you also are like me, not teaching at studios but teaching online, you are free to create tutorials and sequences and videos and instructions and sequences that can actually help yourself or help your students map these movements in their body. So it does require us to kind of think about, well, what is risky about this? What is difficult about this? And how can I likewise regress the movements to put it in my body in a way that is sustainable? Okay. If you prepare the body well, it can do anything. I like that mindset. So I'm going to give you the breakdown, so to speak, of where this class started and what sort of birthed the inspiration for this class, what some of the questions were that I asked in kind of assembling the ingredients for this class. And then we'll go through the sequence and I'll kind of talk you through further what my process was to actually get there from there. It certainly was not linear. I didn't start from the beginning and work my way through the sequence as is the case for a lot of these sequences. I sort of started at the end, or started at the peak, and worked my way backwards from there. Show of hands, who here teaches vinyasa classes at this level? Like, who here has a demographic of students that would be compliant with this type of vinyasa class? So about 30 of you raising your hands. So again, let the takeaways from this be not, here's how to teach a really advanced vinyasa class, but pluck from this the techniques that you can apply to your demographic and the needs of your students and your interest as a teacher. You know, one last thing here is I chose these 4 classes on the platform because I felt like they reflected distinctly different approaches to sequencing. So, you know, any one of these styles could be the subject of its own weekend training or week-long training or longer. I'm giving you sort of a sampler platter to show range and to give you different ideas. But you know, perhaps in the future we'll dive a little more deeply into, say, vinyasa-based sequencing. If you are curious to see what an example of a more fundamental level vinyasa class would look like for me, like a level 1-2 vinyasa class, which in many ways forms the template, forms the basis of what I'm building on as I progress the vinyasa syllabus. Take a look at, perhaps Serena will post it here, take a look at the Vinyasa 101 class that I have on the YI platform. If you are interested in sort of how I would skill build and progressively instruct sort of a beginning level student to adopt the fundamentals of the Vinyasa practice, I have an 8-part program on the platform called Vinyasa Fundamentals. Each session is 30 minutes and builds progressively to a 30-minute kind of full spectrum level 1, level 1-2 Vinyasa practice. So there are plenty of examples of that available to you. I'm sort of, arguably this Vinyasa class that I have is one of the more challenging ones on the platform, but because a lot of what we've looked at already this weekend was less kind of in the realm of like intermediate advanced practice, I wanted to choose this for those of you athlete, dancer, ambitious yogis that want to dive into something a bit more complex and dynamic. So this class had 2 kind of starting points for me. I can't really recall which one came first, but there were 2 things that sort of inspired this class. The first was that particular transition. So actually the peak itself, going from, you'll see what my abbreviations here, AMS is Adho Mukha Svanasana, down face dog. Going from AMS to Wild Thing, I believe the Sanskrit for that is Kamatkarasana, could be wrong. AMS to Wild Thing to, I'm going to say wheel, but word Vidhanurasana. So the peak kind of culminating movement of this class is something that I was interested in exploring in a vinyasa class. And this probably goes without saying, but there are an infinite amount of ways that I could have explored that. This was a chance for me to kind of flex my creative muscle and try some new things in some new ways. Full transparency, I believe around this time there was an Instagram challenge that I saw online. I don't even remember, if I'm being honest, I don't remember who did it, and I don't remember much about it. I wasn't participating in the challenge, but I was scrolling through and I saw a teacher. It might have been Cecily Milne of Yoga Detour. I think there was something along the lines of like, try to keep one hand on the ground and see how many movements you can bob and weave through without lifting your hand off the ground. So I thought that was kind of a fun challenge. You know, you guys could certainly try that. Like, put one hand on the ground and how many poses or movements can you explore without lifting that hand off the ground, which requires quite a lot of shoulder flossing and closed chain shoulder movements. So what we might call like proximal movements, or reverse action, which would be like, instead of moving my shoulder around, I'm gonna fix my shoulder in place and move my torso around. So I thought that was interesting. I thought that was fun. And I was exploring that in my own kind of movement practice. And then I wanted to teach a class focused on this. So I thought, well, maybe there's a way to combine that, because this particular transition, going from downward facing dog to wild thing to wheel, it involves quite a pretty big shoulder, closed chain shoulder like circumduction to accomplish. So I made the choice to kind of pull on that thread and sequence a whole class kind of around this theme of balancing through one arm, ultimately culminating in this particular transition. Let's see here. Here we go. So this isn't necessarily on the worksheet that you have. Feel free to write these questions down. I'm going to share with you some of the questions that then my mind kind of goes through in, as I said, formulating kind of the ingredients for this class. And then we'll dive into the sequence itself. So in no particular order, I would ask, well, what level is this going to be? And you know, there's no kind of clear identification of level, but if I'm looking at that particular transition and kind of what's going to be required just posturally, someone needs to be able to do upward facing dog, upward bow or Vidyanarasana. Someone's going to, the student will need to be able to do wheel pose or Vidyanarasana, flip dog or wild thing, and downward facing dog. So in terms of those three poses, I would say that Urdhva Dhanurasana and maybe not wild thing, but Urdhva Dhanurasana represents more of a level 2 skill. Okay, so if I'm going to combine poses together into a transition that involves some level 2 poses, that class is at least going to be a level 2 class, if not a level 2, 3, or a level 3 class. So I'm looking at sort of the prerequisites, so to speak, to kind of determine where I'm setting the mark for this particular class. So for all those reasons, I would say this class was a strong level 2, 3, or a 3. And depending on, you know, that can be regional. You know, to places in the world, you know, this is a level 10 class. In other places in the world, this is a level 2 class. So to a certain extent, that is that's going to be based on familiarity. So kind of furthering that consideration of prereqs, I want to brainstorm a little bit about not just posturally what does someone need to be able to do in order to participate in this class, but what are some things that I expect a student to be familiar with coming into a class like this. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I'll say like Ujjayi Pranayama. Like my assumption is if you can do Urdhva Dhanurasana, if you know downward facing dog and wild thing, like you probably already understand the basics of yogic breathing in a vinyasa class, right? I'll say Surya Namaskara A and B, right? There's probably a familiarity with sun salutations. I'll say like, well, we'll go with that. Standing pose, flow, okay, which I might often abbreviate as Surya Namaskara C. It's not a particular, for me, not a particular set of movements, but you know, Warrior 1, Warrior 2, Reverse Warrior, Side Angle, Trikonasana, Ardha Chandrasana, Vashisthasana, kind of the movements that are, in my mind, somewhat common in a standing pose flow in a vinyasa class. So these are kind of the prereqs in terms of just vinyasa familiarity. Understand sun salutations and breath-based movement. Now, as we go a little deeper into kind of the movement prerequisites, as I said before, they're going to need to be familiar with Wild Thing, or at least I'm going to need to get them familiar with Wild Thing. They're going to need to have a familiarity with wheel pose. Not that I won't introduce or reintroduce wheel pose, but before I'm going to kind of mess with wheel pose and make it more complicated, I don't want someone coming to this class doing their very first wheel pose ever and then being asked to enter it from a more complicated kind of entry point. That makes sense. So while I teach Urdhva Dhanurasana in this class, you'll notice I really only teach it once as kind of the basic form before I start to mess with it. So when I start to think a little bit more about this particular sequence, it occurs to me that in order to get from Wild Thing into Urdhva Dhanurasana, there needs to be a sort of an ability to progress Urdhva Dhanurasana on one arm. Like if you can't support Urdhva Dhanurasana on one arm, then that arm is going to, or that shoulder is going to be at risk of sort of overloading as you not only support on one arm, but start to twist and turn on that one arm. So I'm going to say a one arm Urdhva Dhanurasana is also going to be required. Okay, and I'm just going through the laundry list here, and that like if someone came to me, let's say this isn't even in the class setting, and said, I really want to do this transition of Wild Thing to Urdhva Dhanurasana, the type of questions I might ask them is like, do you know how to do Urdhva Dhanurasana? Are you able to do Wild Thing? And can you do Urdhva Dhanurasana on one arm? And if the answer to all those questions is no, then I would want to work on those skills first. And that would be kind of the approach to teaching this particular movement. I'm seeing a comment here. It says, my shoulders were fine, my wrists were feeling it more. Yeah, so part of, when I say part of distributing weight through one arm is not just about being able to support that in your shoulder, but being able to support that increased load in your wrists as well. So, feedback from class could be maybe some more wrist strengthening would have been of value. And to a certain extent, the practice itself was wrist strengthening, but not so much in a focused way. There wasn't a section called "Let's strengthen your wrists." So, if that is the limiting factor for you, that would be what to invest in order to further invest in this particular skill. So these are I'll say the basic prerequisites for me in a class like this. If you guys have any others that you can think of, feel free to type them in the chat box. I'm happy to consider. But because these are prereqs for the sequence, that means that all these are going to be in the sequence, less so as kind of an introduction, but more so as like a check-in. Let's make sure all these things are quote unquote in play before we start to combine all of them and make it more complicated. Then in reference or relative to the peak pose itself, this particular transition, I'm going to brainstorm what some regressions or regressed stages of that might look like, most of which are in the sequence itself. Okay, so going from Wild Thing into Urdhva what might that look like maybe positionally regressed? Is that something you can do on the floor? What might that look like from a quadruped position, which we do in the sequence before we do the progressed form? What might that look like standing upright, which we do at the wall? You know, and what might that look like a bit more kind of open or partially closed in terms of chain? Okay, so some regressions of flip dog into Urdhva for me looked like doing it at the wall. So that was a shoulder, I called it shoulder flossing. I don't think I need to demonstrate that. It's in the sequence PDF and it's in the, well, I can actually pull up the PDF. So considering what kind of has to happen in the shoulders to bring us from Urdhva into, rather from down dog into Urdhva, it's this kind of movement. So I'm practicing just the shoulder movement at the wall, going from one arm, right, there's the one arm Urdhva to two arms, and then regressing that and coming out of that particular movement. This is a movement that I like to do independent of a sequence like this. Just feels good in my shoulders and in my thoracic spine. So this was something that was already in play for me that I was able to connect to that movement. You'll notice in this particular position, I'm starting with the hand reversed, okay? And then when we do the Urdhva, the hand also starts reversed, okay? And then in moving down into this regressed position from quadruped, I started with the hand reversed as well. When we go into the full sequence, or the culminating kind of sequence here, the hand is not reversed. And part of the difficulty of this particular transition is you'll notice right about here in this version, the hand actually has to turn on the floor. So you're turning the hand while it's closed chain, which for me is where a lot of the confusion can unfold. So that's a particular area that I want to kind of consider and contemplate. You know, I could have made the decision in the quadruped version or in the at the wall version to start with the hand not reversed, so to speak, and to turn it as well. And perhaps if I was to do this class again, I might make that choice to kind of have that feature of turning the hand in real time as part of the flow, or something that I explore a little bit more throughout the class, just so it's not being introduced at the very end one time at kind of in sort of the hardest position. So that's my own kind of personal feedback. As we dive into the sequence, I'll kind of show you more what my plan for this class was. There's always like the plan and then the reality, and that in many instances is a feature of time. You know, I often plan classes that end up, you know, if I'm planning an hour-long class, it might end up being like 2-hour class. So I have to kind of edit in real time. I'm sure, like, show of hands, anybody else go through that process? Yeah. Okay, so most of the classes that I have on the platform look different than what my plan for that class was, and that's just part of the excitement of teaching. Just a little bit of a tweak on the turn hand quadruped can make or break the ability to transition. Yeah. So I started with that reversed hand in quadruped, so you wouldn't have to turn the hand, but that does mean starting in a position that's a bit more it's deeper in the shoulder. So the progressions of this particular movement, we're doing it at the wall, doing it in, oh, make me big again. Doing it in quadruped, okay. You know, I could have chosen other regressions of this particular movement, like kind of explore how it might look on the floor. In the Vinyasa Fundamentals class, I do a standing version of Wild Thing, that because I'm introducing that for the first time. But these were the regressions that I chose to play with in sort of the section of class that I would call the peak pose section. So we did it at the wall, we did it in quadruped, and then we did the full sequence from Wild Thing, which is inevitably or arguably a progressed version of quadruped, lifting the knees off the floor. And this is an example of how the positional progression might actually be a regression. So, standing is a progression from quadruped, but this particular transition, doing it standing, is a regression in that it's an easier relationship to gravity. Right? It's less weight bearing in the shoulders than when you're bearing your body weight in quadruped and moving through it in that way. So in starting to kind of further flesh out my vision for this class, I also want to consider, like, what category of class is this? And by category, I mean sort of like positional category. What type of class is this going to look like, right? So that transition, it's pretty shoulder dominant, but posturally, it's probably going to be a backbend class, right? Because that is indeed a transition from one pose into a backbend, into another backbend. Okay, so kind of backbend and shoulder focus is going to be predominantly what's explored in this class. Now, what's wonderful about vinyasa, and also what's inefficient about vinyasa, is if somebody came to me and said, I really want to learn this skill, or not this skill, but the skill of going from flip dog into Urdhva I probably wouldn't say, well, do this class, because there's a lot of things we do in this class that don't have anything to do with this skill. Like every time we do a sun salutation, we do Uttanasana, we do Chaturanga, we do downward facing dog contributes to the skill, but there's a lot of forward bending. In the standing pose flow, there's a lot of kind of lateral hip work in the coronal plane, warrior 2, reverse warrior, Parsvakonasana, Skandasana, and arguably, just removing a spider from my midst. Arguably, there are aspects of those poses that will contribute to this particular skill, and there's aspects of those poses that also just kind of help wake up our body and energize our legs and open our hips and warm up our spine that are of value. So warming up and moving our body in all directions is a good idea. But as it relates to this particular skill, if someone came to me one-on-one perhaps, or said, can you help me with this? I might pull more on the kind of regress to progress approach to build up towards this skill in a bit more direct way. So the vinyasa path is inevitably a less efficient path, because there's more that you're going to do in a vinyasa class to kind of give it that look and feel of vinyasa. So all that's to say, this is a vinyasa and shoulder focused class. There's a lot of things that we do in this class that are not, backbend, shoulder focused. There's a lot of things we do in this class that aren't backbends and aren't necessarily shoulder focused, right? So my challenge in a class like this is to take that and then weave it into the sort of vinyasa template, which for me is largely a sort of sun salutation based template. Okay. So, as we start to kind of move closer into the sequencing of this class, and I'm starting to assemble the ingredients, I want to reflect on what are patterns, or what are attributes of this peak pose, say like action patterns, that I could either discover within familiar poses of a vinyasa class, or are found in other poses that I could put into that vinyasa class. And I'll show you what I mean if that doesn't quite make sense. So, for example, one of the patterns here is that we're doing the transition on one arm. Okay? Like, spoiler alert, that's the name of the class, single limb flow. So there's the pattern of doing things on one arm. There's the pattern of back bending. There's the pattern of sort of like, I'll even say like unconventional transition. And that's going to be, relative to your to your familiarity, but for a lot of us, I would imagine going from flip dog to Urdhva is somewhat unconventional. It's not to be found in any lineage of yoga that I'm aware of. So it's sort of a complex transition that also takes us from so more of a forward bend to sort of a side bend through a twist into a back bend. So kind of unconventional, you might say like multi-planar transition, right? So in a level 1 class, I'll just say this, in a more basic fundamental vinyasa class, I'm less inclined to do complex multi-planar transitions. If you don't know what I mean by that, we have the sagittal plane, which moves in this direction. Flexion extension occurs in the sagittal plane. Think Surya Namaskar A, sun salutations, setting up on the mat, going front to back. We have the coronal or the frontal plane, which moves in abduction and adduction, poses like Warrior Two, triangle pose, Ardha Chandrasana. A lot of those happen in the frontal or coronal plane. And we have rotational movements, which occur in the transverse or the horizontal plane. So a lot of the twisting poses occur in that plane. Typically, I'm inclined to sequence my my more fundamental vinyasa classes to couple all of the movements that occur in one plane. So we'll do kind of the lateral angle or frontal plane poses all together. We'll do the more sagittal poses together. And if we are going to do a transition like Warrior One to Warrior Two and change planes, I'm less inclined to kind of go back and forth, right? We'll kind of do things sagittally and then we'll do things coronally. And that's just to prioritize the success of my students. So when we start to weave those together, right, going from, can't quite demonstrate it in my current state, but going from downward facing dog, lifting a leg up, that becomes kind of the sagittal movement, and then flipping open, that's a rotational movement, right? And then reaching back for the floor, there's this kind of coronal movement, a side bend there, and then a further rotation to bring me back into the sagittal plane in upward facing bow, upward bow, and then reversing that. So multiplanar movements, complex, right? And if you look at the sequencing PDF, typically, not always, but typically, multiplanar movements, as you can see here, change my orientation on the mat. So if mat is sort of like my home base, this sort of sagittal plane orientation, and I start to twist and turn, now you can see like I'm not even sure where home base is anymore. Like I'm oriented differently on the mat in these various transitions. So there's an element of neurological complexity as well, just trying to kind of locate myself in space to propriocept as I'm changing my orientation to neutral. So there's going to be a recurring pattern of doing things on one arm. There's going to be a recurring pattern of back bending. There's going to be a somewhat recurring pattern of multiplanar transitioning. And another aspect of the practice, because of those regressions that I'm choosing, I didn't pull on this thread too much, but it's in there, of kind of doing a few things with a flipped grip, with the hands flipped. Okay. So the next things I might kind of consider, if this is going to be sort of what shows up in the various sections of class, or what I progress through the various sections of class, I want to think of, okay, well, what are some poses? What are some poses that are fair game in a, just sidebar here, I'm seeing a few questions coming through. Please put the questions in the Q&A box so I can address them afterwards. What are poses that do this? What are poses or transitions that do things on one arm? What are some back bend poses that can make an appearance in a vinyasa class? Perhaps what are some multiplanar transitions that I could use, and what are maybe some flipped hand positions? So, of course, I'm not going to brainstorm on all of them, but I'll give you the poses that came to mind for me. So poses to include, or poses that I could include. First one that comes to mind is Ashistasana. Okay, so side plank on one arm, Vashisthasana 1 and 2. Okay, so my definition or understanding of Vashisthasana 2 is it's with the top leg reaching up. Okay, so Vashisthasana as a pose that's probably going to make an appearance, and that's not that's a pretty typical pose for me to include in a vinyasa practice, but I might make a bigger kind of lesson out of this, only because it's also a pose that occurs naturally in that progression of flip dog to wild thing. There's sort of a moment where I could pause in and establish Vashisthasana. Another pose within this family, I'll give you the Sanskrit, then I'll define it. So Kapinjalasana is partridge pose. In this class, we do a modification, a modified form of Kapinjalasana. It's essentially when we're in Vashisthasana and we grab our back ankle. So think like Dhanurasana or bow pose in Vashisthasana, holding one ankle. We do that a couple different ways. I think the first time we do it from wild thing, we pick up our foot and hold it with our hand. And the second time we do it before wild thing. Okay, so Kapinjalasana, I'll just say modified. The full form of Kapinjalasana, if you've ever experienced it, is instead of holding your foot back here, you hold your foot this way. It's a pretty elaborate pose. So Vashisthasana 2, Kapinjalasana, I'm including these because they're both, you know, in this case, this is a back bend and it's opposed on one arm. So shares that with the transition into Urdhva Dhanurasana. And Chapasana. Okay. Chapasana means sugar cane. We do this in the pose Ardha Chandrasana. So Ardha is half, Chandra is moon, half moon pose. Okay, I'll show you here on the sequencing PDF. So here's Ardha Chandrasana, and then we do Ardha Chandra Chapasana, sugar cane in half moon. Kind of invokes a beautiful image of sugar canes blowing in the breeze underneath a half moon. So, you know, there's a single limb element in the arm and in the leg, but more significantly, it is a back bend shape. Kapinjalasana, modified Kapinjalasana is here. So that sort of is the single arm balance version of Chapasana. Okay, so what these have in common with the transition into Urdhva Dhanurasana is single limb, back bend, and in the case of Kapinjalasana, I'm going to choose to use that as a transitional stage, moving into wild thing in the sequence. And the other pose that I do in this class that is a single limb back bend. Can you think of what it is? Happens towards the beginning. Just make sure you're still participating out there. Going once, going twice. Yes. So you guys are writing that as bird dog or sunbird with the leg hold. I learned that as, and I might be alone in this, I learned that as tiger pose. Take it or leave, yep, tiger pose. Okay, good. Sometimes, you know, you have these like memories in your mind of like, you heard a teacher say that and it's like, did I make that up or is that what it is? Tiger pose is going to be, now we started with bird dog, so that's a single limb position. And then that turned into what I called tiger taps, kind of circling your arm. And this also served the function for me, kind of turning the shoulder, of mobilizing and warming up the shoulder, because I knew that particular movement is going to make an appearance closed chain as a reverse action when we go into Urdhva Dhanurasana. So we kind of warm things up dynamically and then hold here. So you get a back bend, single limb. And essentially this pose also, can be progressed. I can lengthen the lever, excuse me, on the bottom leg. I can increase the range of motion on the closed chain shoulder, and that's going to look like, I believe I called it tiger pose in downward facing dog. Okay, so in light of our regression progression conversation, perhaps you can see how this is a progressed version of that. And likewise, this would be tiger pose in AMS movement 1 would be a progressed version of bird dog, okay, or the tiger taps. Okay, so those would be kind of the poses that I would say are like established yoga poses. I'm not reinventing the wheel here and going into any of these. If you guys can think of any others that I did, feel free to write them in. These are the ones that came to mind for me. But these are all, for the most part, standard or more kind of conventional yoga poses that are either back bends or single limb poses or both that would make good sense to incorporate in a class focused on a single limb transition into a back bend. Okay, so I'm just kind of pulling on that theme. There are others for sure: Dhanurasana, Ustrasana, Urdhva Mukha Svanasana. Oh, good. I see you, Beverly. Yoga Geek Heaven. Yes. But these are the ones that I chose to include. So I'm just sort of like before I'm gonna even like get in there and try to like organize the sequence, like I just want to fill my cabinet with all the ingredients that I could possibly use. Okay, so I don't know yet what the sequence is going to be. At a certain point, as is true of the somatics class that I shared yesterday, we can geek out to a certain extent and kind of like think about the mechanics and the shapes and the actions and everything like that. But at a certain point, yes, you do just have to get on your mat and move and discover and play and create. And just a quick note, there's different studies and research about this, but like left brain and right brain, and we have that part of our mind that's going to be more kind of analytical and fact-based and scientific and kind of process-oriented. And then we have that part of our brain that accesses our creativity and our intuition and our inspiration and our fluidity. And the yoga system is full of kind of the hatha yoga in and of itself, depending on how you translate that, is an invitation to merge these polarities within ourselves. So, the yoga nerd is one for me that is eager to dive into their left brain analysis of movement and of choices and questions and inquiry, but not at the exclusion of right brain. Right? I'm not making the case that it's better to live in one side than the other. If you always tend to live in right brain dominance, then like adding some protocol, some system, some technique, some inquiry, I think is a really good thing. And then at a certain point, letting that go and diving into kind of the inspiration, of your artistry is also a beautiful thing as well. And in the pursuit of sort of integrating the whole of who you are, that would be like, that's the vibe. Catch the vibe? Okay, so a lot of this sequence was born from me just getting on my mat and playing around and having and looking for opportunities to discover where these poses could make an appearance. Okay. With that said, let's forge right ahead in our yoga geekdom, nerddom, etc. So these would be kind of yoga poses to include. And then kind of along those lines, and you'll see this a lot in this class, thanks for catching the vibe. A lot in this class, you'll see I'm exploring regressions or in many instances, progressions of yoga poses so that I can sort of hack them to fit within the theme, right? So what I mean by that is if I'm looking for single limb opportunities and maybe even some back bend opportunities, I might say, well, how can I take the yoga poses that I know and love, that are familiar, and tweak them a little bit so I can play with different applications. It's not just so that it fits within the theme, but it's also going to serve as potential regressions and skill building stages for where it is that we're ultimately going. So as I mentioned previously, I would say that AMS, that tiger pose in AMS, is a modified version of Adho Mukha Svanasana. If I regress that to a certain extent, that could be a one-arm down dog. So we do kind of one-arm downward facing dog quite a bit. We also do the one-arm downward facing dog twist. Okay, start out class that way, grab the opposite ankle. You know, you might argue that's a pretty standard thing to do in a yoga class, but that is a variation of the pose downward facing dog. So thinking like, how can I continue to find these little one arm applications? One arm plank. Okay, so lifting one arm off the floor. Now, oftentimes when I teach vinyasa practice, a level 1 vinyasa practice, and I'm looking to assist a student, I'll show you this on my mat, in fact. To kind of understand the complexity of and the difficulty of getting from downward facing dog into, say, warrior 1. Let's think about Surya Namaskar B. What is challenging about warrior, the transition to warrior 1, at least for me and for many others, is being able to push into my hands enough to sort of flex my spine, to flex my hip enough that then I can step my foot between my hands. Sort of this thing of like, can I get my foot all the way between my hands? Put this knee down, grab this ankle, and just put your foot there. That could work. What I find that I do typically to get my foot there is I will either lift my wrist up a little bit so I have more space. I might even lift my hand altogether so I have ample space to get my leg forward. That transition of getting my foot to the top of the mat could be made more manageable by opening a chain so that I don't need as much range of motion to get my foot forward. I might even use some momentum. Okay, good. It also is a progression because then for a brief moment, I'm balancing on one arm. Okay, so if I want to kind of, I could use that as a regression to get my foot forward. In this particular class, I'm choosing to slow it down and make it a progression, which says, let's all lift our hand off the floor in down dog and step our foot forward. Does this make sense? So essentially the thing that we might kind of do instinctively to get my foot forward, I'm just slowing it down so that the action is less of a kind of strategy of convenience, and I'm making it more connect to the theme of working with one arm. Okay, good. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. You know, it's sort of serving multiple purposes, right? And the thing that might otherwise be a modification or something to make it easier, I'm, you know, in this way kind of sneakily using it to make things more difficult in the pursuit of, again, skill building, so that the thing that's really difficult will potentially be a little bit easier as we get closer to it. Okay. So I'm riffing on some modified strategies. I have the down dog tiger pose, which is also, didn't mention this, one of you guys mentioned it, one arm balasana, or one arm child's pose. Bala is child. One arm child's pose, lifting the arms there. I also used, so one arm plank also kind of became what I would call awkward plank. Okay, so in the same vein as kind of the down dog tiger pose and the bird dog, right? So let's identify awkward plank as a progression of bird dog. So I have one arm balasana, to kind of take a pretty big jump into a more complex pose, we have the one arm Urdhva Dhanurasana. Okay. And can you guys think of any others? Any other poses that I messed with in this class to include one arm versions of the pose? That's all that comes to mind for me. Child's pose is right here, one arm balasana. Yeah. Easy twist. Yeah, I mean, easy twist. Well, it's interesting. I never know how easy that twist is, but that is a one arm version. And to a certain extent, because I mentioned this class was informed by the that Instagram challenge that I saw, where sort of the participants were encouraged to explore keeping one hand on the ground. You'll notice in a lot of the standing poses, certainly in the beginning of the standing poses, I'm playing with keeping one hand on the ground. In poses like, as you said, I'll say easy twist or twisted lunge. Okay, we do those arm threads from easy twist into kind of a variation of Parsvottanasana, sometimes called pyramid pose, the hamstring stretch. Circling back to grab the back ankle, never sure what that's called, let's say thigh stretch. Heard that called monkey pose before. Okay. And one arm shoulder press. Yes, so then of course the closing sequence, I riffed on that even more, right? And a lot of that was actually inspired by some videos that I saw in that Instagram challenge of the various participants, like playing with those transitions from Ardha Uttanasana or Ardha Hanumanasana and so on. So it would take multiple whiteboards to write all them down, but in terms of postures that I'm consciously modifying or progressing to be one arm versions, it's going to look mostly like these here. It's now time to talk about the sequence itself and how it is I sort of went about actually, I guess, combining these ingredients and where I'm inclined to start in a class like this. And I'll sort of give a combination of, sound permitting, demonstration for you, a combination of working with the sequencing PDF and a combination of the sequencing template that I made for you. In mapping a class like this, because I'm building to a peak, and there's sort of two peaks in this class. One of those peaks is the culminating standing pose flow, and the other peak is the peak transition from down dog to flip dog into Urdhva Dhanurasana. I'm inclined to work backwards. Okay, so in contemplating sort of what elements, I'll put this on the board here, what elements from the peak pose I want to get in play probably during the class itself. Okay, the section that you'll recall kind of is ultimately the section of the standing pose flow that gets plucked out and explored in the peak pose is the section called Vashisthasana 2, Vashi 2, hooking the big toe, into Kapinjalasana, Kapinjala, into Wild Thing, okay, and then back and through the vinyasa. So I'll show you on the PDF in just a moment, but this particular sequence really starts in the beginning of the standing pose flow section as Vashisthasana, then it progresses from Vashisthasana to Wild Thing, then it goes Vashisthasana, Wild Thing, Kapinjalasana, then there's a pause in the sequence where we stand up and we do a regressed version of Vashi 2, aka, I'm going to give you a long abbreviation here, Utthita Parshva Hasta Padangushtasana. I'll show you in the worksheet. So that's standing standing hand to big toe to the side pose. Utthita, extended, Parshva, side, Hasta, hand, Padangushtasana, big toe. Okay. So I know that in the progression of the standing pose flows, I sort of want to get that established as a recurring progressing element, because that's going to provide me kind of the movement and the starting point for the ultimate peak pose. Okay, so let's take a look here at the document again. So just a note about these PDFs, you know, inevitably it's difficult to capture all of the elements of a class, especially a class like this, through still images. So these PDFs really are meant to kind of supplement your experience taking the class. The other aspect that's a little difficult to document is like both sides, otherwise the PDF would be really long. And because in a vinyasa class there's a lot of repetition, we chose not to include like every movement of every sun salutation, but instead to kind of put these notes here that say, you know, repeat slides 13A through 13O, and then, you know, add in this element, right? So you might have to do a little bit of kind of going back and forth between the class or your experience in the class and the PDFs to kind of make sense of how it all fits together, but we did our darndest here. So that kind of culminating element in the standing pose flow that I wanted to build up to is going to be this transition here. So Vashisthasana 2 to modified Kapinjalasana into Wild Thing. Okay. Which essentially we practiced just before that in this kind of standing version, or at least we kind of got the regressed version of Vashisthasana 2 in play in the form of Utthita Parshva Hasta Padangushtasana. Okay. So the culminating flow in this particular class is here. Okay, and I say kind of same as before, like repeat all those things that you did, same as before, and add in these movements. Okay, I'll go ahead and demonstrate it for you, as you know, with the caveat that I'm not currently warmed up in probably the ways that you are. We can move through the beginning stages of Surya Namaskar B. So that's Utkatasana, Uttanasana, Ardha Uttanasana. This is where we do the one arm business of Chaturanga, and then pushing up to lift and go back. Step forward. Here's that simple twist into, just turn around so you can still hear me, into Skandasana, up into Warrior 2, reverse Warrior, Parsvakonasana, Trikonasana, into Ardha Chandrasana, Ardha Chandra Chapasana, back into Trikonasana, into Vashisthasana 2, mark, into Kapinjalasana, into Wild Thing, back around, into the second side. You'll recall that from having just done it a few hours ago. Okay. Hopefully I remembered correctly. So, thank you. It's the fast and dirty version. Let me switch this back on. Okay, good. So essentially, I want to take that sequence. Yeah, me too. Let's do a second side at some point. I want to take that sequence and I want to kind of break it up into stages so that I can build incrementally to it. Okay, so the factors that are going to contribute to my ability to do that, right, are the factors of time. How much time do I have? I also want to consider stamina, right? So like, while it might be nice to do a lot of repetition and add one piece in each time, that means that you're going to be progressing the amount of times you do something, right? So I very easily could take something like that and break it down into like 10 repetitions. I believe I've heard this referred to as like ladder style sequencing, where you just add the next pose in, then you go back, repeat the whole thing, add the next pose in, go back, repeat the whole thing, add the next pose in. So for a sequence like that, excuse me, that involves a lot of poses, that would be a lot of repetition, and you probably would be not so happy with me at the end of a class like that. So, I have 60 minutes in a class like this. That means I might not have time to do all the things that I want to do. So I want to be as efficient as I can to get the things in play that are important to me. And then, sometimes when we do the repetition, you'll notice that certain things get taken out. So I'm going to kind of reverse engineer this. I'm going to start with the section that I'll call standing pose flow. And talk through, I mean, again, you did it, so I don't need to be too explicit, and you have the sequencing PDFs, but talk through the ways that I decided to progress ultimately to culminate in that particular sequence, okay? So the first time that we moved through, so the template that I'm kind of building off of is what I would call a Surya Namaskar B template. I'm pulling that from Ashtanga Yoga. It's the Utkatasana, Chaturanga, up dog, down dog, step forward, warrior one template. So it's a chair pose through a vinyasa, so to speak, step forward into a lunge. Now, in this class, and you'll see on the sequencing PDF, on the sequencing worksheet, I include a section called Surya Namaskar B progression, okay? This class doesn't really have a Surya Namaskar B progression. If it does, it sort of, it threads right into what I might otherwise call the Surya Namaskar C, or the standing pose flow progression. Hopefully that makes sense. So if this was a longer class, if it was an hour and a half, if it was 2 hours, if it was a workshop, we could really, slow things down and work on the Surya Namaskar B component of this. Again, there's the consideration of stamina and repetition to consider. So I made the choice to combine the standing pose flow into the Surya Namaskar B, and this will be the result of that. So I'm going to show you this first, and then we'll go back to Surya Namaskar A. So based off the work I did in Surya A, we already had the kind of basic tenets of this in place, the lifting of one arm in plank, so on and so forth, okay, and all those particular movements. So the first time we stepped forward and we did the twisted lunge, okay, the twisted lunge, we did those arm threads. And those arm threads took us into the hamstring stretch, arm threads to modified, this is Parsvottanasana. Please create that worksheet. I mean, be careful what you wish for. So that was the hamstring stretch, which then we circled back. I might have to refer to my own sequence here before I give you wrong information. I believe that was the first time. Yes, indeed it was. Okay, so then we circled that back around to the thigh stretch. Okay, and then we did Vashisthasana. Okay, so you can refer to, pull up the sequencing PDF if you want to kind of cross-reference what I'm referring to here. But now, when this repeated, I did not repeat Parsvottanasana, so those arm threads weren't a repeating element, and I didn't repeat the thigh stretch. Okay, so that was a chance for me to just prep your thigh, prep your hip flexors, kind of prep your shoulder for all the back bends to come. But didn't necessarily need to be something that we did every time, right? So in considering kind of the peak pose and what it is we're working towards, there are just kind of required elements or preparatory elements that I want to be in the sequence so that you can successfully backbend. But those might not be elements that I need to kind of put on a loop and do over and over and over. So I'm using this first repetition to kind of do some of those things. This Parsvakonasana arm thread has kind of a nice side bend and twist in it, kind of a closed twist, and the thigh stretch is a bit more of an open twist. Okay. In the second iteration, these elements repeat. So there's the twisted lunge. This time the arm threads go to Skandasana. Okay, Skandasana is sort of the single leg squat. Okay, now because that's the first time we do Skandasana, I did it also as sort of a threaded movement, kind of moving back and forth into that position, kind of dynamically with breath, and then we hold it. Okay, and then that comes up and opens out into Virabhadrasana 2. And let me make the point too, like you might wonder, maybe not, how did I come up with that, that peak sequence? Well, elements of it are elements that are pretty familiar. If you've practiced with me before, even if you take that Vinyasa 101 class, Warrior 2, reverse warrior, side angle pose, triangle, Ardha Chandrasana, Ardha Chandra Chapasana, back to triangle, Vashisthasana. That is something that I've taught hundreds, if not thousands of times as a repeating element in sort of standing pose flow work. I would assume that you have all taught that many times too. So I'm not reinventing the wheel in terms of that. If I am kind of adding any sort of innovation or unconventional transitions in, it's sort of this kind of stuff. It's how do we get to Warrior 2, right? So, you know, on a personal note, like how many times have I gone from Warrior 1 to Warrior 2 to Reverse Warrior? More times than I can count. Finding different ways to get there is interesting to me. And in a class that is inevitably for people that are familiar with yoga, I'm happy to kind of mess up the context a little bit and try new things. So going from Skandasana into Warrior 2 felt more interesting, and you can make the case that it's a bit more functional in our body than sort of this rotational movement from 1 to 2. But I made the choice to get into that territory, that familiar territory, in what might for some people be an unfamiliar way. So from Vira 2, then there was reverse, okay, and then we circled back around to Vashisthasana again. Okay. And this time I added in, so Vashisthasana progressed to Wild Thing. Okay. Oof. I'm reading my handwriting backwards, so like it looks just like a quagmire of scribbles, but hopefully you can make sense of my my writing here. Again, refer to the sequencing PDF. So this is step 1. Then in progressing to step 2, I'm taking away some of the preparatory stuff, and I'm progressing both further into the sequence and also progressing this element of Vashisthasana to Wild Thing, because that's going to ultimately progress into the peak. Yeah, I'm going to erase this so we can see. Okay, so then stage 3, we have step forward, twisted lunge to Skandasana, Skandasana Warrior 2, reverse warrior. Now I'm going to further that progression. So from reverse warrior, we go to Parsvakonasana. Okay, Parsvakonasana is side angle, Parsva Kona, side angle pose. From Parsvakonasana, we go to Trikonasana. Trikonasana. Add the ana. So try, 3, Kona asana, 3 angle asana. From Trikonasana, we go into Ardha Chandra Sana. Okay, so I'm getting further. So, you know, in this round, I'm adding in actually 4 more poses than Ardha Chandrasana. You know, if this was a long class, maybe we do all that, and then we do it again, and we add in Chapasana, again, in the interest of time. Figured why make things more complex than they need to be. Let's add in Chapasana here. We already did that. It's one of the reasons why I did that thigh stretch earlier in the sequence. So this wouldn't be the first time that you're reaching back and grabbing your foot. We've already kind of practiced that. It's sort of in play, okay? So then Chapasana. Okay. Then from Chapasana, step back, and Chapasana is going to show up in Vashisthasana as that Kapinjalasana variation. Okay, so from Chapasana, somebody commented on my facial expressions. I just caught a glimpse of one of them. I get to actually watch myself teach, which is an interesting experience. Okay, Chapasana. So then step back, and it's Vashisthasana to Wild Thing. And then I had you possibly pick up your back foot and go into Kapinjalasana. Now, just depending on how nerdy you want to get, like, why not do Kapinjalasana before Wild Thing? Because that's kind of what's going to happen in the full sequence. Well, I wanted to add the unfamiliar element in last. You had already done Vashisthasana to Wild Thing, so let's put you there, get you in the back bend, and then it's actually, arguably Kapinjalasana is a progression from Wild Thing in that you're opening the chain, and it's going to require more balance. So I wanted to take you here first and then open the chain on the floor, close the partial chain on your hand, just to kind of follow that particular pattern. Okay, so this was the third round. Then I knew that in the fourth round, I wanted to add in the pose Vashisthasana 2. Now, in a level 3 class, Vashisthasana 2 is not necessarily something I need to introduce. But I'm also aware, so I'm also thinking, like, you guys are probably tired, been doing a lot of weight bearing on your arms, a lot of kind of facing the floor, transitioning from these poses. So I made the choice to have us stand up and kind of take a little pause, a little break, to practice a regressed version of Vashisthasana 2. So between round 3 and round 4, we stood up and we did Utthita Hasta, Utthita, I'll spell it out, Utthita Parshva, sidebar, I might not be giving you correct Sanskrit spelling here, so disclaimer. Utthita Parshva Hasta Padangushtasana. UPHP. Okay. So yeah, we took a break and did a standing version of that, get you standing and get you balancing on one leg upright. Okay, I think we entered that from Padangushtasana. And then I had you link that into Vashisthasana 2, so then it was come back down. So I'm also thinking about like that pattern of one limb stuff. So then we came down, step back, and we practiced that piece, right? So that piece, which again is going to become the peak sequence or the peak transition, we then practiced in isolation, right? So that was Vashi 2 into Kapinjalasana into Wild Thing. And if I had more time, if I wanted to play with this more, I could have also done this standing. I don't believe we did that in this class, but as a transition, that could look like Utthita Parshva Hasta Padangushtasana into Natarajasana, right? Into like Wild Thing, into Natarajasana, like, and back. Okay, so if for your class, like, that would be the most kind of the peakiest element of this, a level 2 class, that might be the most complicated aspect of class, or you could argue level 2, 3. Okay, so you could regress that further and not just get the Utthita Parshva Hasta Padangushtasana in play, but you could also practice the transition into Kapinjalasana standing upright, and then there's a Natarajasana moment. Someone wrote Natarajasana earlier. in planning a class like this in 60 minutes, there's inevitably more ideas that I have room for. So those are the things that I'm those are the edits that I'm making. I might have actually, that might have actually been in my original sequence, and I took it out because I lost the time. Okay. So from there, all of the elements were in play, and then we put it all together, and it became the culminating flow, which I just demonstrated for you. So I'm not going to write that down. Okay. So moving backwards from that, in the section called Surya Namaskar A, essentially what I wanted to get into play in Surya Namaskar A was that element of one-arm plank. Oh, thank you for the reminder, Yvette. If you are interested, after the Q&A section today, we are going to take a group photo. We figured out how we can get everybody's image on the screen, and we can take a group photo of everyone that was in the workshop. I'm pausing for a second to let you know this. We'll do that after the Q&A section. So if you can stick around, I don't know if we can get 120 people on the screen, but for those of you that can stay, we will take a photo together. Thanks for the reminder. I had it written in my notes to mention it, and I breezed right through it. So what I wanted to get in play in Surya Namaskar A was not only the movements of Surya Namaskar A, but this element of lifting one hand off the floor in plank, and also kind of to begin that exploration of balancing on one limb and back bending. So just briefly, the Surya Namaskar A progression had in it the first time a regressed plank with one arm. So we put bent knees almost to the floor, so shortening the lever, lifted one arm off the floor, chaturanga up dog, down dog, and then we did the one arm down dog. Okay. The second time we did plank with one arm, and the one arm, one leg down dog. Okay. And the third time, that one arm plank progressed to awkward plank, and the one arm, one leg down progressed to tiger pose in down dog. Okay, so pretty straightforward, but again, going back to kind of the inventory of ingredients, I knew I wanted to get awkward plank. I knew I wanted to get tiger pose and down dog just as features of the class because of their affiliation with one arm back bend. So I progress knowledge and use the repetitions of Surya A to introduce elements of that. And to a certain point, it's not to say that, like, for a lot of you, you could have done this the first time. It's not that I'm doing this so that you can all do this, but that's what I like about vinyasa. I like that something starts out somewhat simply and progresses incrementally to ultimately culminate in this complex dance. It's like life. We start out on the ground, we start out on the floor, and we incrementally, gradually progress to becoming the people that we are. So just because you might be able to do something right out of the gate, I like kind of the progressive approach to getting there. Okay. So let's, in the few minutes that we have, let's take a look at the sequencing worksheet that I created for you guys, and I want to just kind of draw some comparisons between this class and how it correlates with that worksheet, and also point out where some of the differences are. This worksheet is, arguably the most open because so much of the contemplations that will go into planning this class occur kind of before the template, or before you fill them in the template. This is all kind of assuming that you've gone through the questions that I've written out on the board for you already and kind of have the ingredients in place. And even to a certain extent that you've kind of figured out what the culminating flow is and everything and the regressions, and then you can start to insert those sections into the corresponding sections of the worksheet. So Peak pose here, in this case, was a transition, flip dog to Wild Thing to Urdhva Dhanurasana. Time of this class was 60 minutes. Theme or the title, I chose to go after more of the actionable title, which is a single limb flow. I guess I'll toss it to you guys, you know, based on your experience. If this class was to have a theme, more of sort of an energetic theme or a metaphorical theme based on the conversation we had yesterday, what might the theme of this class have been? I don't know if I can read your comments and this at the same time. So if you have theme ideas, write them in. I'll read them afterwards. Repeated actions, as I said, it's balancing on one arm and back bending. The level of this class, I would agree with you. It's a level 2, 3, or 3. Props needed for this class, I think, would just be the wall and a yoga mat. Okay, so I say use this template as a springboard. Keep in mind that depending on the length and the level of the class, certain sections may be rearranged or omitted. So it doesn't need to be followed in this order. For this particular class, the section that I would call opening poses was child's pose, quadruped. In quadruped, I don't think I wrote this down, but because I had that theme of flipping the hands, I made the choice to do the flipped hand quadruped. Also a bit of a wrist stretch and warm up. So I think we did cat cow with flipped hands, and then we did the bird dog tiger taps and took that into downward facing dog with the twist. So that to me is opening poses. This section of class, or this class, I didn't have a pranayama section. And you know, you might choose to do pranayama at the beginning of class to kind of get that rhythm in place. What I often do in a vinyasa class, this is something that I learned from Noah Maze. We will often put the pranayama section in a vinyasa class after some kind of arriving, settling, opening poses. The idea for that is you know, before we're going to sit down and really establish pranayama, we all kind of come to the mat from different journeys, different contexts, different things are going on in our lives. It's nice to just get in your body and move a little bit, right? Kind of ground yourself in your body, move, take some deep breaths together. And then once you sort of fluffed off that stagnant energy, then sit down and really establish pranayama. If there's a theme, if there's a message, if there's something you want to say about the class, I think it's nice to do that, at least in a vinyasa class, after a little kind of initial warm-up. The reason that we might not do that in an alignment-based class is that, like, in the alignment-based class, the students are coming expecting alignment. So we might start the class with, you know, an alignment-based kind of explanation of the pranayama and the practice and what we're going to do today. In a vinyasa class, usually people are coming expecting dynamic movement. So let's get them moving so that then they can sit and kind of pay attention to what you have to say. All that said, we didn't have a pranayama section in this class. I think I just invited you to start breathing with Ujjayi in that first child's pose. Okay. The Surya Namaskar A progression, I already talked you through. This class didn't really have a Surya Namaskar B progression. It could have. If that was the case, then I might have built in some of those arm threads, maybe into a Warrior One, kind of just warm up through the lunges in that way. Then this section here that says standing balance pose, typically if I'm doing Surya Namaskar B and then it's an elaborate standing pose flow like this, in the same way that I put that balance section in as a regression of the Vashisthasana 2 as sort of a palate cleanser, I might also put a little palate cleanser balance section in between Surya B and the standing pose flow. So what that would have looked like in a class like this is I might further regress that Utthita Parshvahasta Padangusthasana, the standing hand to big toe, and maybe this standing balance pose here could have been like a tree pose. Okay, and I might think, well, how might I connect tree pose to what it is that we're going to be doing later? Maybe we do tree pose with the shoulder stretch, right? Or some variation therein. Okay, so again, the Surya B progression and the standing balance pose was not a feature of this class, but with more time, that could very well be in there. The standing pose flow, we just talked through all of that. The peak pose work is going to be the section in the sequencing PDF where once we finish all of that, we pause, and then I say, now we're going to go to the wall and work on something. So the peak pose work will typically look like, for me, 1, 2, 3 regressions and progressions of the pose. So, you know, I've used all the work previously to establish some patterns, some actions to prep the body. Now let's pause and work on the thing, okay? Which inevitably is going to look less like a vinyasa class at that point and more like kind of a regress to progress investment in a particular movement pattern. So for this class, that was the shoulder flossing at the wall, then the quadruped entry into Urdhva Then we did, sorry, scratch that. It was the shoulder flossing at the wall. Then we did Urdhva Dhanurasana. We did Urdhva Dhanurasana with one arm and Urdhva Dhanurasana with the other arm. Okay, so that was the element that wasn't already in play from all this work. So, you know, we want to get all those elements on the table, and then it culminated in the peak pose itself, or the peak transition in this case, which was flip dog, wild thing, Urdhva Dhanurasana. This next section is, all the sections are optional to a certain extent. This is another section of class that we didn't do in this particular sequence, but we could have, and I think it would make good sense to you how we could have, assuming that the stamina was there and the interest was there. We could have gone, this might make you grateful that we didn't have more time, we could have gone back and done the whole standing pose sequence again. And when we got to the Vashi 2 to Kapinjalasana to wild thing, then I could have said option to go into Urdhva Dhanurasana, right? So this little peak pose that not little, but this peak transition that we explored also very easily could be then thread back into the standing pose flow, okay? And I think, again, I had that as part of my plan, and I ran out of time. So the culminating flow here is to invite you to consider how the peak pose work could make an appearance back in the vinyasa, okay? The closing pose section, you guys can refer to that from your own tissue memory, and in the sequence, I tried to, you know, do movements that would be nice counter stretches. We did a lot of back bending, so those look like forward bends, twists, and side bends that move the spine in the other direction. And me being who I am, I wanted to still kind of riff on this theme of one hand staying on the floor. So that was just a little flex of my creativity and what I've been inspired by at the time. And then everybody's favorite pose at the end, Shavasana. Okay, what a mega sequence that was. Thank you guys for your stamina, not just in doing the sequence, but in reflecting on the sequence and analyzing the sequence. I certainly hope that you found the kind of the nerding out portion as stimulating as the doing portion. I'm seeing some themes here. Tapas, crawl before you walk, go wild. Yeah. Something in the heart opening direction, anahata, so kind of heart chakra. Bend, don't break, bend so we don't break, wild heart vinyasa. I've read once that wild thing means the unfolding of an enraptured heart. So maybe enraptured heart. I think Kamatkarasana means and then this. It's like, and then after Vashisthasana, then you do this. So enraptured heart is a bit more of an inspired translation. Theming around the air element. Yeah, so you know, with theming, of course, there's many different directions you can take. And you know, as per our conversation yesterday, I love to theme. I can spend a lot of time doing that. In this particular class, I chose not to. I chose for this to be a let's do the thing and let the theme be whatever the theme is for you. Let that be a part of your own experience. Okay. So, as is customary here, I'm happy to give you some further invitation for your own process, for your own homework. If you would like to try your hand at sequencing a class in this kind of style, I'll I'll encourage you to try that with the peak pose of Parshva Bakasana. Okay, so that's going to be twisted Bakasana. Parshva Bakasana is up here on side crane. I do have a class. I have a class on the platform. It's a slippery slip slide twist vinyasa done on blankets that culminates in Parshva Bakasana and some different poses there. If you want to riff on more of a transition, you can try the transition of Parshva Bakasana into Dvipada Kandanyasana, legs to the side, into Ekapada Kandanyasana, and some element there. I think the class on the platform I have incorporates headstand as well, so definitely a strong level 2, 3, level 3 class. So in the same vein as we've been exploring, if you would like to craft your own creative intermediate advanced vinyasa sequence using some of these approaches and post that sequence in the Facebook group, I'll be taking a look at one or two of each of the sequences from the different styles we've explored this weekend and offering some feedback. Of course, it's hard to offer feedback sometimes on a class you can't see. So if you want to post like a sped up video of you doing it, that works too. You know, the last part of the process for me with these sequences, once I kind of have it mapped in my mind, is to actually do it and do the class. And it's in the doing of the class that I can start to answer some of the more, well, some of the more logistical considerations of the class, and also the vinyasa elements, like where do the inhales happen? Where do the exhales happen? How can I, you know, my teaching also is going to progress in a vinyasa class because I'm managing more things. There's the kind of biomechanic aspects of action and instruction. There's the breath component of synchronizing the breath with the movement, which means sometimes taking that off the table just to teach an action and then threading it back in. There's the time element. There's the kind of safety element. Potentially there's a thematic element. There's a music element. So you'll notice the elements I take off the table, the more complex other things are becoming for me. This, of course, is not a teaching vinyasa course because a lot of that is our teaching skills we want to invest in. This really is focused on how you can combine those elements in a way that is meaningful and stimulating and interesting to your students. All right, so that takes us a little bit over the hour, but I appreciate you guys so much for spending this weekend with me and geeking out, nerding out with me. Big thank you to Yoga International for allowing me to do this. You know, this is what I love to do the most, as much as I love practicing yoga and teaching yoga, getting to hang out with other teachers and talk about the choices that we can make behind the scenes is really, really stimulating. And I'm so incredibly humbled and honored and blown away by how many of you from around the world wanted to do this with me. So this is the first time actually that I've had the chance to teach teachers since this lockdown, we'll call it, has begun. And it's a really beautiful reminder that I can still do the thing that I love most, and that's through the participation and grace and good company of all of you. So I hope you've received some good information this weekend. Perhaps we'll do a part 2 sometime in the future and dive into some more sequencing topics and strategies, or maybe some other aspects of what it means to teach yoga. So if you have requests, if you have things that you're wanting to learn more about, let me know, and we'll add that to the mix of consideration for things to come in the future. Much love to you all. Keep in touch with me. You can find me everywhere just by searching my name. Obviously, tons of classes on YI. Instagram is @RockyHeron. My website's rockyheron.com. If you want to reach out to me, stay in contact. Of course, the Facebook group will be a great way to do that. I'm going to continue to monitor that group for weeks and months to come. So continue to stay engaged and share your ahas and questions and all the good stuff in there. Okay. Lots of love, you guys. Please stay safe. Continue to teach and share what you love. The world right now needs strong, resilient, intelligent, compassionate people sharing the gift of movement and breath and yoga and mindfulness. So please stay bright, stay vibrant, and keep showing up as you are. And I thank you. The world thanks you. Your students thank you. We see you. Lots of love. Okay, this is from Jen. What's your perspective on the movement, functional movement, and ancestral movement trends and how they relate to yoga? What's my perspective? Move. I really, truthfully, I can't answer that question. I guess ancestral movement, if we're thinking of like animal movement, primal movement, a lot of the movements that as modern humans living in an age of, you might argue, luxury, we've sort of outsourced. I'm all for the rehabilitation of movements that we don't necessarily need to perform anymore. We live in a time where you can push a button on your phone and pretty much anything that you need can come to you. And a lot of the ways that our ancestors moved was in response to their need to eat and to survive and to find shelter and to migrate to more agreeable locations and everything. So even the notion of having a movement practice is probably something that our ancestors didn't really have. Their life involved movement. So as a movement teacher, I'm often looking at different ways that I can rehabilitate or introduce or encourage my students to move in ways that perhaps their current life doesn't ask of them, so that so they can maintain healthy, resilient, functional bodies and minds. What I love about yoga is it explores the connection, somatics explores the connection between how your movements inform your consciousness and perspective of the world around you. So I'm all for it. Really great book on that subject is Move Your DNA by Katie Bauman, and also her accompanying book of essays called Movement Matters. When you hold isometrics, do you suggest to decrease the count number? First hold, count to 10, second count to 8, etc., decreasing? Not necessarily. My understanding of the research is that it's around the kind of 40 to 45-second mark that adaptation occurs, where more of our available motor units come online. It doesn't have to be 45 seconds all at once. You could do it incrementally, holding it for 20 seconds a couple times, or holding it for 10 seconds 3 or 4 times. Of course, in terms of how you might decrease, it's going to depend on your capacity. So if you're doing an isometric hold for 10 seconds, and then you're resting for 10 seconds, you could certainly do it again for 10 seconds. 10 seconds is a pretty manageable number. And along those lines too, for me, it takes at least 10, 15 seconds just to get all of my tissues, get all of my available, strength to kind of activate. So I have to kind of spend some time putting my awareness in my muscle tissue and activating it, which usually takes closer to 10, 15, 20 seconds. So these are all things that you can play with. And it depends. It's going to depend on how fatigued you are and different factors. When doing if I was going to hold a pose and do sort of isometric engagement and maybe switch the isometric engagement to one side of the joint to the other, or maybe I'm going into deeper ranges of motion, that might be when I would play with kind of decreasing the hold count, and playing with kind of that neural drive flip-flop of inner thigh, outer hip, bicep, tricep, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. Then ultimately, maybe I can do both at the same time. Okay, from Barbara, looking for reference books, Original Strength, where you got some of the principles on developmental movement. That is what I'm particularly interested in researching. That is not where I got some of that. And if I'm being completely honest, I don't think I got that from a book. I learned a lot of developmental stuff from a friend of mine who was a yoga teacher who had a baby, and she was fascinated in studying the different stages of her baby's development. And she actually, the very first teacher training that I taught, she brought her baby into the training, and we watched her baby like go from her tummy to like learn how to crawl, like, you know, progress up to crawling, and a lot of it was just through observation, and you know, watching videos online, talking to different people. So I actually can't cite a particular book on developmental movement. If anybody has any suggestions, feel free to put them in the box. What often happens for me after these trainings is I'm like, oh, of course, and I come up with all these resources that I've come across over the years. So I'll share that in the chat box. Yeah, Jen is saying Feldenkrais. You know, a lot of the somatic education modalities explore these things. You know, a good kind of resource for studying somatic would be the book Somatics by Thomas Hanna. And then, you know, as I said, for me, I tend to learn more from individuals, so, and conversations and things like that. I think the first teacher that I learned anything about sort of developmental movement from was Leslie Kaminoff. He was talking about the development of the spine, kind of talked in one of his anatomy courses about the different stages of human development. So that kind of formed the basis of it for me, and I've just gone on to ask questions from there. Sorry if not the most helpful answer. Yeah, I also see Jen is recommending. Now these are. I'm not sure if there's an associated book that you could access to teach these things, but you know, you're referencing different mobility modalities and areas of somatic education. So Feldenkrais, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's body mind centering techniques do a lot with this. You know, and my initial exposure to Bonnie, or to her work, was through Amy Matthews, who works with Leslie Kaminoff, and she's a BMC teacher. So I learned a lot of the kind of embodiment practices through her work, kind of which she learned from Bonnie. So, you know, once you find a teacher that resonates with you, there's a lot you can glean from them, and there's a lot of sources they might be pulling from. The DNS work, the dynamic neuromuscular stabilization work, is also, you know, I haven't worked with them personally. If Trina's still on the call, I know Trina has done DNS training. I think that's actually where she learned a bit of the regress and progress work, because they make use of that. Please fact check me, Trina, if I'm wrong, but that modality comes up a lot, and I know they do a lot of good work along these similar lines. What is the other sequence besides Garudasana? The first day, I think I invited, the first day I invited you to work on Garudasana as a kind of regress progress sequence. For the isometrics class, I invited you to explore Bakasana. For the themed class, I let that be open to you. And for today's class, it was the partial Bakasana. I took a weekend level 1 training with them and highly recommend it. Yeah, it's the DNS. Okay, from Jen, how do you teach students about sensing, engaging tension and compression forces? I think what you're referring to, I remember years ago, I took an online course. I think it was an online product from, I want to be diplomatic here, from Paul Grilly, that was focused on, I think it was called Yoga Anatomy. And the focus of that course was sort of on being able to sense or identify where your end ranges of motion were, both by identifying, you know, if I say I want to dorsiflex my ankle, if I go to dorsiflex my ankle and I feel limitation here, that would represent a tensile limitation, right? I'm running out of compliance of these tissues to lengthen, versus if I felt compression here, right? If it felt the obstacle here, that would represent a compressive limitation. Based on my understanding now, I think it's a little bit reductive to suggest that if you feel compression, that would be an indication of the way your joints are organized, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you feel tension, that has to do more with your muscle tissue or your fascia, and that is something you can change. So one of the takeaways that I got from that workshop, and again, it's a long time ago, so I'm not going to speak to what it says in that workshop, but what I got from it was that compression represents things you can't change, tension represents things that you can change. What's sort of left out of that conversation is an analysis of our nervous system and how it is that the role our nervous system plays both in giving us feedback about our ranges of motion and sensation about where, what's going on in our body, proprioception and kinesthetic awareness. So the position that I hold now is that, our joints, our bones do play a role in our ranges of motion, but there's so many other tissues and factors that can contribute to that suggesting to somebody that if you feel compression, it means that there's something that you can't change. I think that's actually not true. So I don't really spend so much time necessarily encouraging students to sense or gauge compression versus tension. I'm more interested in asking questions so I can get a sense of what they are sensing. Yeah, so there's different techniques that you can use to increase your functional ranges of motion. A lot of those are techniques that we've looked at this weekend. There's a whole system of mobility training called FRC. I'm not an FRC teacher, but functional range conditioning. Pilates is in large part about learning to control your ranges of motion. And sometimes when we go into ranges of motion where we can't control, or where we sort of lack the capacity to stabilize those forces, we might get feedback that feels like compression or that feels like excess tension that could change as we learn to create more dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, so to speak. So I don't have a clear-cut answer for you there, only to say that the premise might not be something that I necessarily resonate with currently. Okay, from Cheryl, what are some regressive drills that one could implement to make one arm shoulder floss more accessible as you work towards standing back bend? Good question. So that particular drill is done as a proximal movement. So again, when I'm referencing a distal movement, typically distal movements are movements that occur from anatomical neutral, where your trunk, your pelvis are stationary and you're moving your limbs. You're moving the more distal parts of your body or your legs. In a proximal movement, or what we might refer to as a reverse action, the limbs are stationary or more stationary, and it's our trunk that's moving. So in the movement at the wall, that shoulder floss, the arm, our arm is stationary, and I'm sort of moving my spine around that. So how we might switch that from a proximal to a distal movement could be something like this. Maybe you guys have seen these before. I have some classes on the platform that do that. So instead of moving my trunk, perhaps I do it by moving my arm, right, and exploring kind of the rhythms in my shoulder. With, in this instance, a partially closed chain here, which is really just giving me feedback as to where my arm is in space. Now, this is going to be a little bit beyond the movements that we do at the wall, but essentially that's sort of like, that starts here, okay, out at the wall. And then as I turn, my arm goes up here, and then the hand turns, and there's Urdhva Dhanurasana. Okay, and then it unflosses this way and goes back out to the side. So it looks like a relatively gentle movement, which it is. I feel like I want to do the other side now because it's not nothing. So you can try it quite heavily regress. You can also try that on the floor, supine. You could even try it in quadruped. So you could explore some of these shoulder movements in a different relationship. In a different type of class, that very well may have been the approach that we would take to get to this part of the sequence. Because it was vinyasa, stopping and grabbing a block and doing all that, you could find a way to do it, but I made the choice to not. All right, from Melina, how do you lift up safely from Skandasana? I have to sit, and then it's too hard to lift up without using my hands. What could a regression of that pose be? Yeah, so Skandasana is a great example of a pose where your knee is in really deep flexion and past your ankle, and a lot of the muscles that connect to your knee and your hip are in a pretty lengthened position. So, and then you have quite a lot of body weight to lift, no offense, like we all do, from that position. So standing up from a pretty deep squat, when our muscles are in a lengthened position, our joints are in pretty deep ranges of motion, and we have a lot of weight to lift, that would represent a pretty difficult ask of our nervous system and of our capacity. So a couple of different ways you could develop that strength would be to regress. So instead of kind of being in a Skandasana here, which essentially is asking you to lift by engaging the back of this leg, pushing down, engaging the back of this hip, pushing down to come up, okay, you could regress and work on lifting up from Malasana, right? So working this way. You could also regress by decreasing the range of motion and closing a chain between your pelvis and the floor. So oftentimes when I teach Skandasana regressions, I'll use blocks under my pelvis. Okay? So it's essentially kind of a seated pose. And, in terms of building strength, you can build strength without actually creating the movement. I'll tell you to explain that. So I might get somebody in a position like this and give them the instruction, like pretend that there weren't blocks underneath you, right? So instead of just letting your legs hang out, press into your heels as if you were going to lift off the blocks. And so you can start to develop that strength here in a position that's much less loaded. Then you might encourage them to tip their weight forward and see if they can kind of use a combination, or you yourself, of rocking forward and lifting your hips and coming back down. Right? Rock and lift and come back down. If that's not the case, more blocks. Okay, so start up higher. Okay? Or you might try it eccentrically, where you start in the standing position and you see about lowering slowly onto the blocks. So often a strategy, if you don't have the power to get up from something, work on the control to lower into something. It's often how you'll see pull-ups worked as a regression, is start in the pull-up position and slowly lower yourself if you don't have the power to pull yourself up. So once you kind of work that, and you can get all the way up and down, then you can progress the range of motion and get up from a lower position. And then you might open this chain. You could also do this from seated, right? From seated, shift to your pelvic, to your feet, and come all the way up. From Orly, do you feel we do yoga teaching a good service if we don't share some wisdom? Your thought of just getting into the practice. I saw a really wonderful post some years ago, no, not some years ago, recently, a couple months ago, from, who was it from? It was from, Trina, if you're there, you'll have to help me with her last name, Laurel Bevelsdorf. Am I saying that right? Or maybe I'll look it up. I don't want to butcher her name. Really great teacher. She does a lot of work with resistance bands and kettlebells and such. Give you the, yes, Beversdorf. Thank you, Trina. And she was talking in the post about sort of her rejection of the notion that yoga is somehow a superior practice because it's more than just physical.
And in light of what we were talking about yesterday with theming, I really appreciate that because I try not to, I'm more of a non-dualist than a dualist. I don't necessarily subscribe to the notion of like the physical and then the non-physical. I think that everything that we do intersects dimensions and intersects aspects of ourselves. You attempt to look at an atom, which is the building block of life, and you see there's really nothing there. An atom is empty space and energy and information. So I don't necessarily think that there's anything less virtuous about diving into our physicality. And as I said yesterday, if you are practicing skillfully, if you're practicing in a way that recruits all of your faculties to participate in the endeavor, you are embodying yoga philosophy, right? At least the parts of the philosophy that ask you to be present and to consistently practice and to show up and to pay attention. I don't know if, like, at what point, like, how do we define what wisdom is, right? If I'm giving you good, sound, wise instruction and advice relative to your body and the way force moves through your body, and if I'm helping you progress in your skills, is that not wise? Is that not intelligent? Is that not yoga? So I guess in short, I would say, first I want to know what you mean by wisdom. Does it need to be like spiritual wisdom or wisdom that applies to more areas of life, metaphor, theme? And I think that we do yoga a good service by teaching well. And whatever that looks like for you, if that's diving into the physicality of the practice, if that's inspiring your students to increase and expand what's possible for them, if you can help somebody accomplish something and evolve their capacity and the way that they view what is possible for them, it doesn't matter to me about doing yoga a service. I want yoga to service us. So I don't feel an allegiance to yoga necessarily. I feel passionate about finding ways to allow the system of yoga to benefit us where we're at. It took a long time for me to get to that point, truthfully, because for many years I felt like I owed something to yoga. And I do still feel that way in the sense that I want to evolve how it is we view yoga, because I think for a lot of folks, yoga is viewed through a very kind of limited lens. And as such, it feels exclusive. It feels like some people can't access it, or it's not for some people, or different personality types won't be able to benefit from yoga because they can't fill in the blank, they can't relax, or they can't focus, or whatever. So I'm happy to adapt the practice of yoga to meet the individual where they're at, so that it can be a benefit to them, as opposed to the other way around. Okay, from Lisa. In today's flow, which I loved, I had an issue in the transition from dog to urdhva. I used to be able to do this easily, but I haven't practiced in a while. I found that during the transition, I felt a pinch in my sacrum on the right side. Not sure where that came from. Thoughts? I'm not sure where it came from either. I would probably want to ask some more questions and take a look at what your ranges of motion are there and your capacity there before I would tell you what it is. What I would encourage you to do is kind of take a look at the movement itself and identify, like, maybe regress that aspect of the movement, and consider some other ways that you could explore that movement, perhaps out of the complexity of that particular transition. Our sacrums are pretty resilient, our SI joints are pretty strong, and they contend with a lot of force. So if you're feeling excessive compression that's resulting in pain in that area, it very well could just mean that it's unfamiliar. You haven't done it in a while. There's a lot of different moving parts happening. So you might consider, what we didn't do in this class, truthfully, is a lot of kind of symmetrical loading of the SI joint in extension, things like bridge work. So if sometimes with a class like this, we kind of move through the complexity of the movement, and it sort of alerts you to maybe a deficiency or an area for improvement in your own body, which might then mean like, let's put this sequence aside and work on your hip extension, work on the strength of your glutes, work on your ability to send compressive force into your SI joint in a way that feels sustainable. And that's going to be a more functional endeavor in my mind than getting into flip dog Urdhva Dhanurasana. But we can invest in that and then go back to this sequence and give it a try and see what happens. But whenever we're sort of sending these complex asymmetrical and sometimes extreme forces into the two halves of our pelvis, it's not dangerous, but there's a lot to manage in all of that. And it's to be expected from time to time that we get a little feedback that like, that might be a little bit too progressed an endeavor. If it's something you haven't done in a while, as you said. Using no theme and a few alignment cues, was that to see what we integrated from the earlier practices? No, in the sense that this class I recorded, I think the very first time I filmed classes with Yoga International, I filmed this class. It was one of the first classes that I created. So, I didn't create these classes in sequence for this course. They already existed. I just went back and kind of combed through all the classes that I did have, and I, along with Serena, kind of selected the classes that we felt would best exemplify the sequencing strategies I wanted to share with you guys. So I wish I had a more like, yes, this was all planned 2 years ago, but no theme and few alignment cues for this class was, I might push back a little about the few alignment cues. It depends on how you define alignment cues. I'm definitely giving you instruction on what's important to me. But the things that weren't important to me in this class, or the things that I assumed you could manage on your own, I wasn't speaking to. So, in this particular class, like, it actually didn't matter so much to me in Warrior 2 that your thigh was parallel, your shin was vertical, and your knee was over your ankle, like, because that wasn't really relevant to my goals with this class. So sometimes I will give less alignment cues because I'm assuming you already know, especially if it's a higher level class. Other times I'll give less alignment cues because it's not important to me. I don't always think that everything needs to be perfectly aligned in order to be, as we talked about in the beginning of this session, in order to be safe, or in order to be better, I guess. So there was a phase in my teaching where I thought that more was more. I wanted to say everything there was to say about everything. And as I learned more, I realized I don't have time to say everything I have to say about everything. So I want to say what is important and what is relevant to my goals. So for this class, I didn't have the goal of really riffing on a theme or breaking down a lot of the more fundamental poses. So I prioritized things that contributed to that peak. I do know that in reference to one of the previous questions, Trina did post a link, as they're still on it, to that post from Laurel about yoga as more than, or the tenets of a practice being more than physical. I really liked her reflections there. Stephanie, what are your thoughts around 90 minutes versus 60 minutes? Especially for a level 2-3 class that is somewhat complicated. When I first started doing yoga, this was in like the early 2000s, every class was 90 minutes, and most classes would go at least 15 minutes over. So like every class was 105 minutes. So my thoughts around a 90-minute class is that, like, that's kind of what I'm used to. But I'm also aware, like in my life too, like because I have more diverse movement interests than just traditional yoga practices, and I like to move my body in a lot of different ways, I would prefer that my classes, or when I go to take a class, I do kind of prefer a shorter class because then I have the stamina to do other things that day. Like I could take a 60-minute class, I could still go on a little hike. I might even still have time to kind of do my own personal like strength practice at home or something. So because I'm often doing different things in my movement practice in the course of a day, I like more bite-sized pieces. That's just more personal, not really to your question. I think it's a good skill to possess, to be able to scale your classes to be shorter or longer. You know, it's like you'll hear like I've heard nerdy yoga teachers kind of brag about like, I could get my students into Urdhva Dhanurasana in 30 minutes. Like, oh, it takes me 45 minutes, or I could do that in 60 minutes. I could do that in 20 minutes. You know, so depending on the tricks you have up your sleeve and your ability to kind of, you know, you'll see a lot of the classes that I have on the platform, you know, if it's a 20-minute class or a 45-minute class or a 60-minute class or a 20-minute class, I am not going to insist that it has all the features of a class. So many of the classes that you've done with me this weekend don't have a theme, don't have like an arriving and settling. There's not a chant. There's not even a shavasana. You know, so the shorter the class is, if a student is coming to a class of mine and saying, you know, I want to come to a 45-minute class, I don't feel obligated to provide them with all of the elements that for me would represent like a full course yoga meal. If they're coming to a 90-minute class or a 2-hour class or a 2.5-hour class or a 3-hour workshop, then yeah, I have time to kind of give them more of the things. But in a shorter class, I want to get in and get out and get right after what it is I'm going for. So this was an example of a level 2-3 class that was a 60-minute class, and I think, you know, was somewhat successful in skill building towards this somewhat complicated endeavor. Could I have done this in 45 minutes? Probably. Could you please, this is from Unette, can you please describe all the planes of movement? I can't seem to remember any other than the sagittal plane. I'm going to give you a kind of a smug answer, which is this is a really easy Google, right? So I learn a ton from Google, because whenever I'm like, oh, I need to like remind myself of this, that, or the other, or even on YouTube, in YouTube planes of movement, and you know, there'll be so many great examples of this with images and all kinds of things. So when people ask me where I've learned a lot of things, I say like YouTube University and google.com. That said, I'm happy to show it to you, but there's lots of available resources here to kind of keep you remembering and maybe even to give you a better view of it. So sagittal plane occurs this way. You view this, the sagittal plane is viewed from a profile. I always think of like playing like Mario Brothers, like those old video games where everything just occurred in the sagittal plane. Okay, so sagittal movement occurs front to back typically. The movements of the joints that occur in the sagittal plane would be flexion, extension. The coronal plane or the frontal plane is this plane, right? Sort of the mirrored plane. If I was standing on my mat this way, facing you, long edge, a lot of the Iyengar transitions occur in the coronal plane. So abduction, adduction, and lateral flexion occur in the coronal plane. Fish swim in the coronal plane. And the perspective view for coronal plane movement would be from the front. The horizontal or transverse plane is rotation, okay? And you would view movement in the horizontal or transverse plane from the top or the bottom. Sometimes it's called the axial plane. Tanya's question: good resource to find various poses that are unfamiliar. I don't know all these poses. Okay, so the best resource that I know to really like give you a full download of a lot of these, I'll call them like traditional yoga poses, a lot of what I've referenced, Kapinjalasana, Utthita Parshvasana, Padangusthasana, all this, they're all in Light on Yoga. So before I'm going to send you in directions to look at other resources, before I started practicing Iyengar yoga, I had Light on Yoga as like one of the books for my teacher training, although I don't think we ever really used it. But I like that was like a bathroom book for me. Like you flip through and look at that crazy guy doing those crazy poses. But I would go to Iyengar teachers' classes and be like, where are they coming up with these wild, crazy poses? And then I was like, oh, sure enough, they're writing that book. So, there are many things to be said about Iyengar yoga and potentially Iyengar himself. But in terms of his contribution to yoga poses and our understanding of isometrics as it relates to full body movements and postural study, don't take that book for granted, because there's a lot in there. And for me, when I reference like traditional yoga poses, I'm usually referencing Iyengar's sentiments on poses. So the Sanskrit definitions that I tend to use as sort of a baseline for me are from the Iyengar tradition. And it's for no other reason that like Iyengar was kind of the first guy to document all these poses and write down, his sentiments on them and name a lot of them. And in many instances, invent a lot of them. Like as far as you can invent a shape, invent a movement, he was a great innovator in the development of yoga asana. So, I've spent my fair share of time practicing Ashtanga and practicing Iyengar yoga, which arguably forms the basis of a lot of modern postural yoga and vinyasa-based practices. So, knowing your history certainly helps you to continue to evolve it, and that's the resource I would recommend, Island Yoga. And I'm glad you're addressing the idea of dangerous or provocative poses. How are you managing these from the online teaching platform? I'm concerned for my students even further, as I'm not in the room with them. I sort of have like different categories of teaching. One of those, and we've explored them throughout this weekend. One of those categories is like, let's play and let's get kind of wild. And the invitation there, because the class is identified as a more intermediate advanced practice, is like, take care of yourself. I'm not saying that you need to practice this way. I'm not saying this single limb flow is something that like everybody needs to build up to be able to do this. Like, this very well may not be in the realm of possibility or even interest or benefit for you, and that's totally fine. For folks like myself that have been doing yoga for a long time and I have good self-management skills that relates to my movements, a class like this is fair game. But in general, the direction my teaching has evolved over the years is less about kind of, I guess, classes like this, and more about function. And when I'm working on function, I'm more interested in helping my students increase their capacity to tolerate load and manage more complex forces in their body. So that's why I rely heavily on the principles of regression, because even if somebody can do a complex pose, I want to regress it, not just so we can get there, because there's many interesting things we might discover by regressing our movements, but so that I can build incrementally an understanding of what the priorities are. So, when I'm teaching anybody something about anything, I don't just want them to know how to do it. I want them to understand why they're doing it and what to be paying attention to in the pose, so that they can self-manage and understand, like, okay, if I'm going to go a little deeper, am I going deeper at the expense of losing engagement somewhere that might be important, right? So I use a lot of words in my classes because I want to educate. And I also want to strongly discourage the notion that deeper is always better, and that the goal is to progress the range of motion at all costs. So I will often regress things to a level where I feel like my students are able to adequately engage and support and stabilize. And then I'll say things like, to the extent that you can maintain that, feel free to flirt with going a little deeper. And then I want to encourage the sort of self-reflection of saying, when you straightened your knee, or when you folded deeper, or when you stepped onto one leg, did your outer hip, for example, stay engaged, or did it not? okay? It doesn't matter so much to me that you can stand on one leg or two legs. It matters more to me that you can pay attention to what happens in your tissues when you create a shift like that. So to answer your question, I think I just continue to encourage self-reflection on the part of my students as almost kind of the more significant aspect of the teaching than the poses and the shapes themselves. And I also try not to approach my teaching with the priority that I keep. So hear me out before you react strongly to this. But my main priority when I teach is not to keep my students safe. I would like for my students to stay safe. I would like to mitigate the inevitability of injury and pain. I mean, these things happen to all of us, so it's somewhat inevitable if you practice and move and strength train for a long time that something will happen. So I want to minimize that possibility, but more so I approach my teaching with a passion to inspire my students. I want people to feel inspired to move their bodies. I want them to feel curious and compassionate and a sense of wonder about movement and how their bodies operate. So I try to approach my teaching not through the lens of injury prevention, but through the lens of joyful curiosity and empowered understanding about movement, which means a lot of kind of myth busting, because a lot of the very well-meaning desire to keep people safe turns into fear mongering, unfortunately. From Diana, to go into Kapinjalasana, do you need three-legged down dog preparation? Probably Ekapada Rajakapotasana. Well, Ekapada Rajakapotasana is a big pose, right? That is done in 4 different stages, either with the front leg in lunge, in pigeon, in Virasana, or in Hanumanasana, and then this kind of big grip of your back foot. In terms of, I see what you're asking. I think you're asking to do like Kapinjalasana in its full form. Any pose that sort of invites you to grab your foot behind you. Oftentimes how we do that is by kind of this, I'm not gonna do it right now, but this sort of grab your foot and like twist and wrench yourself into the flipped grip position. And when I'll say used to, I haven't done it in a long time. When I used to practice Kapinjalasana, that's how I would do it. I'd reach back that way and then flip my grip to get into it. That's one of those shapes that it can feel really nice. It can feel really fun. It's, in my mind, not the most functional in that it's really just a demonstration of your passive range of motion. Because like if you wanted me to grab my foot and like wrench it around into that Rajakapotasana position, I could. But if you asked me to just like reach back and bring my hand and my foot together, it would be like miles between my hands and my foot. So my passive range of motion can be like wrenched into that position. My active range of motion is far less in terms of my spine, my hamstrings, and my shoulder. So I think how like Iyengar in almost all those poses, Nataraja as well, gets into them is he says like, reach back and grab your foot, right? So he's using his active range of motion to get his foot. Same thing in Kapinjalasana. So, take from that what you will. I think definitely if you want to work on that skill, Ekapada Rajakapotasana is going to be an easier position in which to work on it than, balancing on one arm, flipped sideways, grabbing your foot behind you. So if that was the sequence, if that was the class, we were working towards that, we would probably do a lot of like Pinchamayurasana work, forearm work, like Ekapada Rajakapotasana work, strap work, to kind of open all that up. All right, from Roberta, questions keep coming in. I do love questions, so Serena, if I need to wrap it up at a certain point, you can let me know, but I got time. Hi Roberta, if you have the same students for 3 classes a week, would you integrate the sequences of the classes for the week, or the classes would be completely independent. I think what I hear you asking is like, if you're teaching 3 classes a week, like, can you sequence over the course of those 3 classes? Or would you do 3 totally different things each class? And the answer is sure, either way. I mean, there's not one right way to organize a split. You'll notice in this weekend training, even we did 4 very different things, so that you got a kind of sampler platter. There's obviously a recursive element, or there's a repeating element. But if this was called something else, if this weekend was called vinyasa sequencing, then probably we would have started with like level 1 vinyasa on Friday, level 2, or maybe mixed level vinyasa strategies on Saturday, and level 3 on Sunday. But this was going after a more diverse approach, so we did diverse things. So, if you have a hard time deciding how to split up the classes that you're doing with people, you can borrow a page from like weight training, which is like every 4 to 6 weeks, just change up your approach. So you could do a 4 to 6 week split where you do like, Mondays is upper body focus, Wednesdays is lower body focus, and Fridays is a full body focus. And then that repeats every week. And then after a month of doing that, you could switch to something else. Mondays, we do more isometric work. Wednesdays, we do more mobility work. And Fridays, we do more vinyasa stuff. And then the next month it could switch, and it's this week we're going to work on arm balances, this week we're going to work on back bends. I think a diverse approach to sequencing is also useful, and you can repeat it for a set amount of time before you switch up your approach. From Melissa, what was most impressive to me as a vinyasa teacher was your ability to remember such a complex sequence. Does that just come easy for you, or is there a particular type of prep work that you do to be so cognizant? I've been teaching a weekly class where we work towards a different peak pose every week for a year and a half. I do the class myself beforehand, which helps, and there are times I have had only 15 minutes to create the class, which then requires my notes to be near for reference. Just curious, any advice on this? Everyone's going to have different capacity to remember things. I have a good memory when it comes to my sequences. I have a bad memory when it comes to like appointments and things. I don't know. I mean, like, I think my background, as I said, I studied acting in school, and obviously to get up on stage, and I also studied improv for a number of years, and so I think I pull on those skills often, both in my ability to like remember my lines, remember my marks, and also to be able to improvise if I forget. So a lot of the sequences, as you've seen, as I've mentioned, a lot of the sequences on the platform, I forget like halfway through the class what I planned on doing. So I have to improvise, and then that becomes the sequence. Sometimes when I'm filming with YI, I have the opportunity to have a whiteboard there, and I can write down I usually just write down little like key marks and things I want to remember. When I teach workshops, I usually put on my phone, like in notes. I just write down whatever I need to remember to kind of keep on track, and I keep my phone there. So I use notes often when I teach. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And then if I don't have the notes, I let myself improvise, and I pull upon, the knowledge that I have to develop things on the spot. Sometimes my sequences look really simple. Like it might just look like, I'll say like, if I'm working on a particular pose, like Ardha Chandrasana, it might say just like supine regressions, crawling regressions, seated regressions, standing progressions, and then I'll put a couple notes of some ideas I have. So if a lot of these sequences, even like with this vinyasa class, there are many aspects of this vinyasa class that I've taught many, 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 many times. I'd never taught this full sequence before, but I've taught flip dog to Urdhva I've taught shoulder flossing at the wall. I've taught these things a lot of times. So the more things you have in play, just in terms of what you've done before, the more the more it's like copy paste of little movement vignettes that you already are familiar with. This class, because it was kind of complex, I was referring to my notes kind of fervently before I went to go teach it, to be like, just want to memorize, the progressions just so. So I don't really have any tips there other than like challenge, if you're used to practicing with notes all the time, get rid of the notes sometimes and do your best. And if that means that you forget and you have to think on the fly, it'll help you develop that skill. Sally, can you say what informed your decision to do AMS with the ankle class prior to the one-arm swimming AMS? It feels to me as if the ankle class is more physically demanding from a balance standpoint, which makes you wonder if, in your opinion, the progression and regression really needs to be sequential in complexity. Truthfully, I just, in terms of how that was going to progress to the sequence, I think you're referring to doing down dog, grabbing the opposite ankle and doing the twist, that ankle clasp versus reaching back and grabbing the ankle clasp. It's going to sound maybe not so satisfying, but I just think it feels good to do that down dog twist. I wanted to do that in the opening section because that movement kind of applies less to the Surya A progression. So it wasn't so much that was less complex or more complex. It just, what I wanted to build towards in the flow was more of a progression to a back-bended version. So I chose to do the twisting version in the opening section instead of doing that after. So, to your point, yes, not everything needs to be, and you can make the case that is a progression or a regression for any number of reasons. So one arm and leg lift is open chain in those limbs. Holding your ankle is partially closed chain, so that would be a regression. But it's not to say that everything in a vinyasa class needs to be, thank you, Orly, that everything in the vinyasa class needs to, be a straightforward progression of everything that comes before. Things are going to fold in on themselves, and inevitably, someone's progression is someone else's regression, depending on their familiarity. Hope that answers your question. From Colleen, long question. A couple of years ago, I stopped teaching chaturanga, mostly because many students weren't interested in learning it. I also can't remember the last time I took a class where a teacher actually taught the pose other than saying chaturanga. I kept teaching flow classes, but got so much resistance and pissed off students that I stopped teaching flow about 6 months ago. Do you have any advice or suggestions for teachers like myself who would like to teach flow classes without chaturanga? I guess, like, the advice that I have, you're probably not going to like. First of all, you don't have to teach chaturanga. I mean, if it depends on what you define as flow. So for me, when I teach a vinyasa class, to me that means sort of sun salutation based movements. Now, it can be a fun challenge to say, I'm going to teach today. We're going to do let me answer you this way, and I think you'll see this theme present in a lot of my teaching. For me personally, the fact that people don't do something well is not a good enough reason to stop teaching it. If anything, that inspires me more to help empower students to do it. So instead of taking chaturanga off the table because people don't do chaturanga well, I would strongly encourage you to find ways in a vinyasa class that you can help students improve their practice of chaturanga. If you want some ideas for how I do that, the Vinyasa 101 class has some regressions of chaturanga and shows how I would introduce that to a level 1 student. The other thing you can do is refer them to my isometric push class, or make your own little video tutorial on chaturanga progressions and say, go to my YouTube page and there's a tutorial on how you can work on chaturanga that's really going to make a vast improvement in your experience in taking vinyasa classes. When I teach vinyasa classes, and maybe because I teach online a lot or as a guest teacher, I'm wanting to set students up to be successful, not just in my own class, but I want to help improve their yoga practice in general. So, just taking poses off the table because I don't like the way people are doing them doesn't really fulfill my intentions as a teacher, which is to help progress the capacity and the ability and the understanding of my students. So I would kind of poke a little bit at you and encourage you to find some clever ways that you could regress or help students improve on their chaturanga practice within the context of a flow class. And if you don't like teaching flow, you can still work on chaturanga as it could be a workshop, it could be a more alignment-based class. But I think a body weight push-up is a good skill for people to have, and it's something that it's a fundamental strength training maneuver. There's many different ways that you can regress that. It's harder to do in a vinyasa class because it's part of a flow sequence. But I would encourage you to spend some time with chaturanga and see if you can develop a increased appreciation for it that perhaps you can pass on to your students. And if you want to teach a class without chaturanga, by all means do that. But there's a lot that builds from that skill that you won't have access to if you take it off the table altogether. Any books that recommend that have regressions and progressions? If you're asking Cheryl about like books that show regressions and progressions, any book on yoga pose modifications essentially is showing you regressions and progressions. It'll be up to you to kind of identify why the regressions and progressions. I think in Trina's course, the Regress to Progress, I know she's running a sale on it now. It includes a resource of pose modifications and stuff with that in it. You can let me know, Trina, if that's the case. But otherwise, no. Maybe I'll make one. All of my classes and on the platform have pose regressions and progressions in them, and I've given you the terminology at least today, so that hopefully you can go in and kind of further discern in what ways they are regressions and progressions. Can you suggest a peak pose for more of a level 1-2 class for us to practice sequencing? Sure. For vinyasa, Adrian, I'm assuming? A peak pose for level 1-2 class, Bakasana. I would say, if you want to arm balance, Ekahasta Bhujasana, it's this one. Vashisthasana 2, that level 1-2? I don't know. Take your pick of arm balance that feels appropriately level 1-2 for you. For me, the fundamental arm balances are Bakasana, Lolasana, Vashisthasana, Ekahasta Bhujasana. I would love to do a 300-hour TT online with you. Oh, cool. I am in the process right now of figuring out how to do that. So stay tuned. And if you want to study live with me, I do teach live 2 and 300-hour teacher trainings. My next 300-hour teacher training is co-taught with Noah Maze and myself, which begins in the fall. Okay, you can reach out to me privately, and I will send you information about that. It's in Los Angeles. Okay, 2 more here. Could you recommend a couple of wrist strengthening exercise ideas or drills? Sure. So my favorite ways, well, first of all, a great way to strengthen the wrists is just to load the wrists. So quadruped and walking on your hands is a great way to strengthen and load your wrists. You can also work on strengthening the wrists and stretching the wrists eccentrically by doing these sort of wrist push-ups, okay, which kind of stretch and strengthen the underside of the wrist, the palmar surface of the wrist. You can also do that on the back of the hands, this way, finger push-ups. And even just things that work on grip strength can be really nice. Hanging on a bar, even doing just this, bunching up, bunching up and squeezing onto towels and blankets. A big component of wrist strength, I find, is grip strength, which we don't work a lot in the yoga practice because we don't grip onto things so much. But when you have strength in your palm to distribute force more through your fingertips and so on, it helps to organize some more of the force that runs through the carpal bones of the wrists. So working on grip strength is a great way to encourage healthy wrists. Okay, last question. Was your initial teacher training in any specific lineage before you started branching out? Yes and no. I did my 200-hour training at a Power Vinyasa studio. So the teacher that ran my training was a Vinyasa-based teacher, but we didn't really do a lot of lineage. It wasn't like we were studying a lot of Ashtanga or Iyengar. It was really more, it was a power Vinyasa training. So I sort of got my teacher training and learned how to teach in that particular style. And then as my teaching journey progressed, I encountered different styles over the years. You know, when I first found Ashtanga, I was like, oh, it was very interesting to me to see that a lot of what I learned in Vinyasa came from Ashtanga. So I spent a good, year or so really diving into that practice and doing the whole Mysore style protocol and waking up early and doing Ashtanga. And then I found Iyengar yoga. I was like, oh, there's so much to learn here. Spent some time with Bikram yoga as well. Kundalini, I've spent, I don't want to say enough time, but I've spent my fair share of time investigating different styles of yoga to then have kind of, in a sense, graduated to the point where I'm able to pick and choose from what resonates with me. Truthfully, the more I've learned about biomechanics and human movement and explored other styles of movement besides yoga, a big thing for me was learning more about strength training, bodybuilding, and weight training, because that taught me a lot about tissue adaptation and force vectors and loading. And then from what I learned there, I was able to go back to my yoga practice, and it provided broader context for just the movements of yoga, independent of lineage. So when I call myself a mutt now, it's really more that I'm a student of human movement and human physiology, more so than I am of any particular yoga lineage, because I have a language that I can apply to all forms of movement that helps me to unify my understanding of what it is my body is doing, what it is I'm doing, as opposed to having to kind of jump from different styles. But because of my time spent in different lineages, I'm able to, fortunately, I think, speak the language of different yoga practitioners. If I'm talking to an Ashtangi, I'm able to, speak their language. If I'm talking to someone that does Iyengar yoga or Vinyasa yoga or Bikram yoga, I can kind of speak enough of that language to be able to communicate. But usually when I do teacher trainings, as it relates to pose study and shape study and movement study, I try to establish a shared language around an anatomical vocabulary, just so that regardless of what style you come from, we can address what's going on from an anatomical perspective in the body, and then kind of superimpose that into different lineage language. Okay, you guys, I made it through. Made it through these questions. Those are great questions. Thank you so much for, thanks for asking, and thank you for being curious. I always say this in my trainings, but I could spend all day with questions, because when new questions come in, that means I get new answers that come out. So thank you.